In a world where passion and loyalty collide, Susan, a striking beauty from a wealthy family, finds herself entangled in a web of deceit. Torn between her stable marriage to Stephen, a successful but reserved lawyer, and the thrilling affair with Tony, a charismatic political aide, Susan's life spirals into chaos. Secret meetings at the secluded Latham Inn, a bold proposal from Tony, and a tense confrontation at a high-profile party push her to the brink. As Susan navigates these dangerous waters, her loyalty is tested, her emotions are torn, and every decision she makes could shatter the life she's built. Will she choose passion or remain loyal to her husband? The Latham Inn was a quiet, discreet spot where Susan could spend time with her boyfriend without drawing attention. It was the perfect hideaway, a dark, private place with occasional events like karaoke and trivia, but mostly just a peaceful retreat. Susan, though unfaithful, was considerate. She loved her husband, Stephen, a kind and thoughtful man, but their relationship lacked the excitement she craved. Susan, a striking beauty admired by many, was the younger sister of the wealthy DeVos Singleton family. Despite her loyalty to her family's reputation, she couldn't resist the allure of other men. Her marriage to Stephen, a shy lawyer who struggled with self-promotion, was stable but lacked passion. While Stephen was dependable, Susan found herself drawn to the thrill of other relationships, especially with Tony Greco, a tall, confident political aide to the governor. Tony was everything Stephen wasn't: charismatic, strong, and exciting. Although Susan cared deeply for her husband, she couldn't be content with just one man. Her adventurous spirit, a trait shared with her sister Mary, kept her from staying loyal, though she always returned to Stephen, who, despite his modest stature and shy nature, held a special place in her heart. Susan's life was a balancing act between maintaining her public image and indulging in the thrill of secret affairs. She was ambitious and driven, always striving for more, whether in her career or personal life. Her relationship with Tony was a reflection of this, as she enjoyed the excitement he brought into her otherwise predictable life. Yet no matter how far she strayed, Susan never intended to let any man come before her husband, a reflection of her complex feelings and the inner conflict she constantly navigated. When Susan finished her thoughts, she realized her worries were unfounded. She had enjoyed herself and wondered what the harm was. Meeting Stephen Fitzgerald taught her about attraction. Though he was shy, he was very good-looking. At 20, 4 years younger than her, Stephen wasn't easy to get close to. Their relationship felt strange and challenging. She had to pursue him while he resisted. Eventually, her persistence won him over, and their wedding night brought them closer. But Susan still longed for more. As she asked the bartender to turn up the TV volume, breaking news about the Hamilton trial flashed on the screen. To Susan's surprise, her husband, Stephen, had been Roger Hamilton's lawyer, a case he had taken almost by chance. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Hamilton, Stephen's skills in the courtroom led to a not guilty verdict. Susan, hoping for at least a small victory, had pushed Stephen to speak to the media, despite his shyness. Later, Tony Greco, Susan's lover, arrived, and they exchanged a warm but subtle greeting. Tony admired Susan but felt conflicted. He was jealous of Stephen and troubled by his growing feelings for a married woman. Tony intended to propose to Susan, but Stephen's unexpected success made him hesitate, realizing that Susan's attachment to her husband was stronger than he had anticipated. As they discussed the news, Tony masked his jealousy, knowing that anything that pleased Stephen left him uneasy. Tony struggled to keep his smile as the national news highlighted Stephen's surprising courtroom victory, sparking debates among legal experts. They criticized the prosecution for mishandling the case, allowing Stephen, dubbed Foxy Fitzgerald, to sow doubt among the jury. Even the commentators couldn't help but acknowledge Stephen's good looks, which only deepened Tony's unease. Susan, excited by the news, called Stephen but got his voicemail. Tony, concerned that his plans for the evening might be derailed, asked if she still wanted dinner. Susan reassured him with a smile, mentioning that Stephen would be too exhausted to celebrate until the next day. After dinner, Tony revealed that she would be offered the job of media consultant for the governor. Susan was thrilled, giving Tony a quick kiss on the cheek. But Tony, who had planned to propose, decided to wait for a better moment, perhaps the governor's ball next month, where they could be seen as a couple. As Susan drove home through the misty countryside, her thoughts drifted to the life she had built with Stephen. Their home, once a small farmhouse, had transformed into a sprawling estate, a reflection of the life she envisioned, one filled with success and, hopefully, children. Her mother's recent question about grandchildren lingered in her mind, a reminder of the expectations placed on her as the only hope for a male heir in the family. Stephen was a good husband, smart, reliable, and supportive, but Susan's ambitions extended beyond their quiet life. She wanted to achieve greatness, and Tony was a part of that dream. She envisioned a future where she would be more than just Susan DeVoe Singleton. She could become Mrs. Anthony Greco, standing by his side as he climbed the political ladder with her own career reaching new heights. Catherine cared for Mary's husband, Jason, but was disappointed he had only daughters. Stephen, on the other hand, had been hard to convince, but Catherine admired his sharp mind even more than her own husband's. When she first met Stephen, she appreciated his thoughtfulness, though she wished he was more comfortable in the spotlight. Susan felt a mix of emotions as she climbed the stairs after her time with Tony. Their encounters were intense, filled with passion and a sense of closeness that made her wonder if Tony wanted to take her away from Stephen. Despite Tony's jealousy, he managed his feelings well, not pushing for more than she was willing to give. As Susan prepared for bed, she felt a familiar excitement about being close to Stephen after being with someone else. Stephen, exhausted from the day, was already asleep when Susan joined him. The morning brought playful intimacy, reminding Susan of the unique bond they shared. Stephen's gentle nature, almost feminine at times, made their connection special, even though she craved the excitement of other relationships. She was careful to balance her adventures with her dedication to Stephen, ensuring he never felt embarrassed or neglected. Susan was a complex wife, supportive, encouraging, and financially helpful, yet her flirtations and outside relationships fueled her own boldness. She enjoyed bringing that thrill back to her marriage, where she could tease and play with Stephen, keeping their relationship lively. As they lay together, Susan playfully challenged Stephen, but his serious reaction to her teasing made her realize he might be carrying more than she understood. In that moment, she sensed there was something deeper at play, especially considering the high-stakes case Stephen had just won. The American economy faltered, making the rich richer while many struggled. Roger Hamilton thrived in this environment, growing wealthier and more arrogant, oblivious to the hardships of others. He took his good fortune for granted, behaving selfishly. His wife, Shelley, the daughter of a wealthy doctor, initially tried to fit into Roger's lifestyle but soon became a burden to him. On the night of her death, Shelley had dinner with another man at their home, when Roger returned at 2:17 a.m. And he called 911 to report his wife had been shot. The evidence pointed to Roger as the prime suspect. His recently cleaned .38 caliber gun was used, and Shelley was 8 weeks pregnant. Despite the strong case against Roger, Stephen Fitzgerald, nicknamed Foxy, took on his defense, rejecting a plea deal and opting for a trial. Stephen saw a different narrative. Roger returned home to find Shelley with another man, leading to a deadly confrontation. But to win, Stephen needed to reshape the story entirely. He meticulously reviewed the evidence, searching for new angles, and began by visiting Mrs. Jean McCarthy, a neighbor. Mrs. McCarthy lived in a small house next to the Hamilton mansion. Her lawn was small, but the Hamilton gardener often mowed it along with the Hamiltons' lawn. Stephen lied, saying Roger had asked him to check on the gardener's work. He charmed Mrs. McCarthy, bringing her homemade muffins, though his wife, Susan, didn't bake. Through his conversations, Stephen pieced together details that would help him shift the jury's perspective and cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Stephen made several visits to Mrs. McCarthy, hoping she would become a key witness in the Hamilton case. Mrs. McCarthy, an older woman who lived alone and missed her family, found comfort in small routines like watching Jay Leno and preparing meals for her son's weekend visits. Stephen, knowing her loneliness, engaged her in conversations about her life and subtly guided the discussion toward the night of Shelley's murder. During one visit, Mrs. McCarthy mentioned that she had been watching Jay Leno before noticing Roger Hamilton taking out the trash around 1:15 a.m. Stephen carefully pieced together her account, ensuring she recalled specific details, like the guest on Jay's show and the timing of events. He skillfully adjusted her timeline, understanding how small inconsistencies could be exploited by a good prosecutor. Stephen's patient questioning revealed that Mrs. McCarthy might have mixed up some details due to her age and solitary lifestyle, a realization that could weaken the prosecution's case. As the Hamilton trial began, the defense methodically challenged the prosecution's evidence, particularly the forensic details, casting doubt on the reliability of the witnesses and the accuracy of their testimonies. Stephen's careful preparation began to pay off as the prosecution's case slowly unraveled under scrutiny. The coroner, with over 30 years of experience, was nearing the end of his career and growing frustrated. During cross-examination, Stephen Fitzgerald pressed him on the time of death, which the coroner estimated to be around 11 p.m., though he conceded it could have been as early as 9 p.m. or as late as 1 a.m. Despite the coroner's confidence, Stephen's persistent questioning planted doubt in the jury's mind. The prosecution then called eyewitnesses, including a valet who claimed to have seen Shelley Hamilton at a restaurant with a tall, imposing man. The valet's testimony seemed to strengthen the prosecution's case, but things took a turn when Lori LaFave took the stand. Lori described the man with Shelley as controlling, but her testimony hinted at something more. When Stephen revealed a photograph of Leroy Johnson, a maintenance worker who had only been referred to as a black man, Lori identified him as the man with Shelley, throwing the prosecution off balance. The prosecution objected, but it was too late. The judge allowed the testimony, noting that the defense had cleverly outmaneuvered the prosecution. Lori further described Leroy's outfit, matching it to a jacket she recognized from her job at a store that sold clothing for larger men. Stephen's strategic questioning left the prosecution scrambling, and the judge, impressed by Stephen's tactics, realized the young lawyer was more formidable than he appeared. Lori LaFave, struggling to make ends meet with 3 children from different fathers, was now on the stand, facing a tricky situation as the prosecutor aimed to discredit her. He tried to corner her about her connection to Stephen Fitzgerald, and she pointed out that Stephen often visited McGuire's with a woman named Susan Singleton, his wife, sparking laughter in the courtroom. Stephen capitalized on the moment, jokingly confirming that Susan was indeed his wife, which lightened the mood and caught the prosecution off guard. The prosecutor then moved on to Lori's identification of a jacket, expecting her to falter. But Lori confidently noted that the jacket was not cashmere but wool, implying the fibers found on the victim did not match the defendant's clothing. This forced the prosecution to drop the line of questioning and move forward. Next, Eleanor McCarthy, an elderly witness, took the stand. Nervous at first, she relaxed upon seeing Stephen's friendly face. When asked about seeing Roger Hamilton on the night of the murder, she confidently stated she saw him at 1:45 a.m., contradicting her earlier statement to the police. Despite attempts to confuse her, she stood by her timeline, leaving the prosecution flustered. Stephen, sensing the momentum, chose not to question Mrs. McCarthy further, letting her firm testimony stand. The prosecution then brought in several witnesses to attack the defendant's character, but their efforts seemed increasingly desperate. As the trial continued, Stephen called a private investigator, Martin Lux, to the stand. Lux revealed he had tracked Leroy Johnson to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the courtroom, causing reporters to rush out and leaving the prosecution scrambling to regain control. The prosecutors chose not to question the witness further, unsure how to prove Leroy's presence at the Rio Hilton during the trial. The defense quickly concluded, leaving the prosecution scrambling. Despite their request for a break, the judge allowed Stephen Fitzgerald to proceed. Stephen confidently presented his closing argument, emphasizing Leroy Johnson's guilt, even though Leroy wasn't present to defend himself. Stephen's direct approach, coupled with his strategic questioning, left the district attorney unprepared. The DA's rushed closing argument contained errors, further weakened by the defense's clever tactics regarding the timeline and evidence. The jury quickly returned a not guilty verdict, surprising the media, who had expected a different outcome. Celebrations followed, with reporters scrambling to adjust their stories. However, the narrative shifted when Leroy returned from his unexpected vacation with a solid alibi, captured on security footage and supported by multiple witnesses. The public's perception changed, and articles criticized the justice system's favoring of the wealthy. Despite this, Susan Singleton admired her husband, Stephen, across the kitchen table. She knew he had freed a guilty man, yet she couldn't help but support him. Stephen remained silent about the small bribes and manipulations he had orchestrated to secure the verdict, including paying a waitress to slightly alter her testimony and giving the gardener hush money to keep quiet about a bullet shell. As the media's focus shifted from the Hamilton case to the upcoming presidential election, Susan noticed that her husband, now dubbed Foxy Fitzgerald, was becoming a figure of public fascination. Meanwhile, Stephen moved on, keeping his secrets hidden as he presented a bill to Roger Hamilton, which included the cost of Leroy's trip to Rio, a move that subtly reminded Roger of the consequences of pushing back. Morphine and the small hand resting on his were the only comforts for Thomas McManus as he lay in pain. That hand belonged to Mary Ann, his wife of 30 years, who had even taken his last name so their 3 children would share it. Thomas, now 73 and recently retired, was battling cancer, while Mary Ann, at 50, faced the prospect of many more years alone. Mary Ann had met Thomas when she was just 19, drawn to his charm despite his position as a bishop in Brooklyn. Although they appeared to live separately, Mary Ann was always by his side, raising their children in the background. She was a devoted wife, supporting him quietly but resolutely. Yet Mary Ann was no ordinary woman. She was clever and had prepared for the harsh realities of life connected to the church. Having traveled extensively, including several trips to Rome, Mary Ann was well aware of the difficulties faced by women like her, often hidden in the shadows of powerful men. Determined not to lose everything, she carefully protected her family's wealth, securing important documents and records. Her most significant discovery came from a secret file she found in Thomas's safe, a file with the potential to ruin lives. Mary Ann knew the file was both powerful and dangerous, containing a record of wrongdoings meant for desperate times. Faced with a moral dilemma, Mary Ann struggled with the decision of whether to keep the file, destroy it, or reveal its contents. The weight of the secrets it held tested her sense of right and wrong, forcing her to choose between protecting herself and her family or exposing the truth. Meanwhile, at the governor's ball, Susan Fitzgerald Singleton made a stunning entrance with Anthony Greco. Her elegant black dress and family heirloom green gems showcased her beauty and wealth, capturing everyone's attention. As they approached New York Governor Edward Kincaid, he welcomed them warmly, teasing Tony about his role as Susan's escort in place of her husband. The governor's remark hinted at Tony's jealousy, subtly acknowledging the tension between him and Stephen Fitzgerald. Stephen Fitzgerald didn't expect an invitation to such a grand event, mingling with the wealthy and influential. His brief fame from winning the Hamilton murder trial had passed, but as Susan's husband, he was still part of this world. Displaying her relationship with Tony Greco in public wasn't an option, so keeping their distance was necessary. Stephen had looked forward to thanking his old trial coach, Governor Kincaid, for helping him hone the skills that won the Hamilton case. But Susan delivered the thanks on his behalf, loud enough for others to hear, leaving the governor with a smile. Kincaid took pride in Stephen's success, though no one could quite explain how the unusual defense strategy led to a not guilty verdict. Most assumed Stephen's moment in the spotlight would soon fade, but as the governor's former student, Kincaid felt a connection worth acknowledging. As Susan moved through the crowd, she easily engaged with influential guests, many of whom recognized her family. She was in her element, navigating the social scene effortlessly while showcasing her support for Governor Kincaid, who was eyeing a presidential run. Susan knew this was just the beginning of a long campaign, one that could end in either triumph or disappointment. Throughout the night, Susan and Tony danced, impressing the crowd with their grace. Tony, a skilled dancer, made it clear that Susan was his focus for the evening, but his intentions went beyond just one night. He suggested they get some fresh air, and as they slipped outside, unnoticed by the guests who were focused on the governor dancing with Dr. Simon Redmond, Susan followed him into the garden. The garden, bathed in the light of the harvest moon, provided a serene escape from the grand ballroom. Tony wrapped his jacket around Susan's shoulders as they walked, the warmth of the October night adding to the intimate moment. The nearby South Mall buildings loomed in the distance as they strolled, their path illuminated by the moonlight, marking a quiet pause in an evening filled with political maneuvering and unspoken desires. The large state office buildings loomed like something from another world, contrasting with the beautiful historical garden where Susan and Tony stood. As they kissed, Susan felt the warmth of his embrace and the intensity of their connection. For a moment, Stephen seemed far away and Tony was her entire world. But then Tony pulled back, breaking the kiss and holding her tightly. "I have something to ask you," he began, his voice serious. Susan, thinking he wanted to get closer, whispered, "Not here, love. Someone might see us." But Tony had something else on his mind. "Will you marry me?" he asked. The question shocked Susan, cooling her emotions instantly. She smiled warmly, trying to keep things light. "This is sweet, but what about my husband?" she replied, half laughing. Tony pressed on. "We both know he can't give you what you need, and your feelings for me are stronger." Susan, who had let many men down gently in her life, knew she had to tread carefully. "I care for Stephen. We're married, and he hasn't done anything wrong. How could I hurt him?" she said softly. She loved Tony in her way, but marrying him was something she couldn't imagine. She knew men like Tony wouldn't tolerate a partner with a past like hers. What was he thinking? She leaned into him, resting her head on his chest. "Tony, you're a good man, but Stephen is my husband. He won't accept a divorce, and I can't risk putting you in danger," she whispered. Tony, taken aback, had never considered Stephen a threat. He didn't realize that Stephen was more dangerous than he appeared, calm, clever, and heartless. Susan knew Stephen's sweet smile was a perfect mask for a man who could focus on his goals without guilt or fear. As the garden doors opened and guests spilled outside, Susan seized the moment to step away from Tony. "We should go back in," she said, distancing herself as they returned to the ballroom. The room had emptied as the band took a break, giving Susan the chance to find a distraction. Spotting Laura Sullivan, Susan greeted her warmly. Laura, a senior associate at a big law firm and the wife of Stephen's best friend, had much in common with Susan. Both women were a few years older than their husbands and had chosen partners they could lead. After introducing Tony to Laura's companion, Frank Patterson, Susan and Laura slipped away to the bathroom. Once alone, Susan turned to Laura with genuine relief. "I'm so happy to see you." Laura echoed the sentiment. "I'm really glad, too." Laura sighed. "I had to come when a senior partner invited me, but his plans go beyond just a dance or two." Susan chuckled. Despite their differences, they shared a deep understanding. Laura wasn't as strikingly beautiful as Susan, but her blonde hair and dark eyes gave her a memorable allure. While Susan was taller and more graceful, with captivating black hair, the biggest difference was their backgrounds. Laura didn't come from wealth. Laura's husband earned little as an assistant district attorney, while she provided most of their income. However, her job felt uncertain, and she dreamed of a stronger partnership and a bigger salary, hoping for a stable future with a large home and children. But until she reached her goal of making partner, she worried about men who saw her only as a pretty face to exploit. In the competitive world of a big law firm, success required both brains and beauty, qualities Laura had, but the real question was how far she would go to use them. "Does Patterson have ideas?" Susan asked. "Yes, but they mostly involve the bedroom," Laura replied with a smile. As they reached the line for the women's restroom, Susan teased, "I don't think that's a bad place to end up." Laura smiled back. "You're a real tease, but I'm married now. Things are different than when I was just dating Patrick." The two women had shared many fun moments before their marriages, both enjoying the attention of handsome men. Susan had settled with the easygoing Stephen, while Laura had married the fiery Patrick Sullivan. "You know, we have the same issue, just in reverse. You're trying to keep away from your guy, and I'm trying to get closer to mine," Susan said. Laura looked puzzled, so Susan explained. "Tony proposed to me." "What? Are you going to leave Stephen?" Laura asked, surprised. "Don't be silly. It's just about letting Tony down gently," Susan said, grinning. "Oh, the troubles you face," Laura laughed. When they returned to the men, they found Patterson and Greco deep in a political debate. Tony looked relieved to see the women again. Sensing the tension, Susan quickly intervened. "We leave you alone for just a bit and you start a fight. Typical guys. What are you arguing about now? Whose team has the best quarterback?" she joked, lightening the mood. Tony stepped closer to her. "Not that. Everyone knows Eli Manning is the best. But Frank was just saying his friends in the assembly are huge Giants fans." With the women's return, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Susan noticed Patterson's clear interest in Laura, while Laura seemed uncertain, sending mixed signals. Susan thought Laura needed a reason to act, something to justify her feelings. Susan felt a sense of relief, realizing she had moved past such indecision. "If you like someone, just go for it," she thought. "If your husband is good and cares for you, there's nothing wrong with that." But these were thoughts she could never voice aloud. Stephen was a good man, and she couldn't imagine leaving him. Tony, noticing Susan deep in thought, joked, "Do we need to pay for your thoughts?" She snapped out of it. "Oh, sorry. I was just thinking about a question someone asked me earlier." She gave Tony a meaningful look, and he smiled back. Just then, the band started playing again, providing a welcome distraction. Susan pulled Tony onto the dance floor, pushing aside the nagging questions in her mind. Tony, confident in their connection, was sure her answer would be positive. He believed it was only a matter of time. In early November, Stephen Fitzgerald sat in his modest office at a big law firm, reflecting on how he owed this opportunity to his wife, Susan. Her family's connections had set him apart from other law graduates, and while he had performed adequately, it wasn't until the Hamilton murder trial that his career gained any real momentum. The case had been a lucky break, and now the firm was beginning to recognize his potential. Today, his role was about to change. "Come in, Steve. I have someone here who's looking forward to meeting you," Mark Tolan, the firm's senior partner, said. Tolan, a strong Irishman, was a commanding presence, even as he aged. As Stephen prepared himself, he noticed the tall, handsome man in his early 50s sitting across the table. Extending his hand, the man introduced himself. "I'm Edward Jameson. It's great to meet you, Steve." Jameson studied Stephen carefully, seeing a man who appeared unassuming and non-threatening. Fitzgerald wasn't Jameson's first choice, but when clients are in trouble, tough decisions are often necessary. "Ed has a case he hopes we can help with," Tolan said, hinting at the challenging situation ahead. Stephen, sensing the potential for a high-stakes trial, felt a rush of excitement. "I'm the lawyer for, and a good friend of, Samantha Whitmore," Jameson began, allowing the weight of the name to settle. Samantha's husband, Stuart Peabody Whitmore, a wealthy man, had been found dead in their Westchester home's stables, a Colt 1911 in his right hand. But from the start, the police dismissed the idea of suicide, focusing instead on proving Samantha guilty of murder. "I've known Samantha since she was a young girl. I don't believe she did what they claim," Jameson said, meeting Stephen's piercing blue eyes. A tense silence followed before Tolan started to speak, only to be halted by Stephen's firm hand on his arm. "Jonathan Cotell is handling the case now. He's splashed it all over the papers and wants to change the plea to insanity, likely for more attention," Stephen said, staring directly at Jameson, who nodded. "I'm not sure where you got that information, but he's insisting on changing our defense strategy." "Samantha refuses," Jameson admitted, struggling to keep his emotions in check. Stephen stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Send me everything right away. I'll give you an answer by the end of the week." "Is that enough time? There's so much to review," Jameson asked, but Stephen was already leaving. "It should be, but we need to start immediately if we want to win." Later, Samantha Whitmore prepared a private dinner in the cozy ladies' parlor of her Westchester home, awaiting Stephen Fitzgerald. When she first saw him, she noted his movie star looks, though he was shorter than she'd imagined. But it was his eyes, sharp, intense, and all-seeing, that truly captivated her. As they began discussing the case, she realized he wasn't there to merely assess, he was there to uncover the truth. "Why did you hide what happened to your husband?" Stephen asked softly as he unfolded his napkin, his gaze never leaving hers. Samantha was shocked. How could he know? She considered denying it, but his next words stopped her. You found him and called for help before you fully realized what had happened. You knew why he chose to end his life. It was his secret, but you both knew it." Samantha looked away, feeling exposed. "You can't possibly know that," she whispered. "I'm guessing you loved him deeply despite his infidelity," Stephen continued. "Yes, I did," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But if that were true, why would he have left those final words for you?" Stephen pressed, his voice gentle but firm. Samantha, shaken, asked, "How did you find out?" "You said it yourself," he replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He explained how the police collected evidence but lacked the insight to interpret it. But they missed one crucial detail, a Whitmore family secret. "What should I do now?" Samantha asked, her eyes filled with worry. "The clear choice is to reveal the truth behind the old lie. Everyone involved is gone, so who would it hurt?" Stephen suggested. "I can't. I have children, and I must protect Stuart's memory. We had 27 special years together," she said, her voice trembling. "That puts me in a difficult position. After all, innocence is the cornerstone of any defense," Stephen replied, finally offering a genuine smile. The scene shifted to the courtroom, where Linda Siegel, known as Mighty Mouse, stood ready to make her case. At 4'7", she wore 6-inch heels to boost her height to just over 5 feet. Despite her small stature, she had a commanding presence with a voice that didn't match her petite frame. Linda Siegel wore a pinstripe skirt suit that was just a bit longer than the norm, highlighting her figure in a way that caught the eye. While not conventionally beautiful, she had a charm that often made men act foolishly. Smart and determined, she was ready to take on the defense's slick lawyer. "We've had too many delays in this case," she remarked, mostly to those who agreed with her. Judge Adam Grant, a black man in his 40s and the adopted son of a wealthy Westchester family, was known for his biases. He found the young Jewish assistant district attorney acceptable, but he had a deep disdain for the Irish defense lawyer Stephen Fitzgerald, whose good looks and fancy suits represented the part of society Judge Grant despised. "You make a good point, Miss Siegel. I don't see why a last-minute change in lawyers should hold up the trial. However, the court schedule is tight, and we won't have an open date until next month. That gives you nearly 5 weeks, Mr. Fitzgerald. I suggest you make good use of this time," the judge said with a hint of irritation. Stephen stood, responding with a touch of sarcasm. "Thank you, Your Honor. That's very kind of you." The judge noticed the tone but chose to let it pass, saving his grievances for another time. Linda, on the other hand, was pleased. A 30-day delay was more than enough for her to prepare, but she knew she had to be cautious. Stephen Fitzgerald was clever, and she was determined not to be outmaneuvered. Linda usually focused on winning over the jury by playing to her strengths, especially her ability to appear non-threatening due to her small stature. But she knew that strategy wouldn't work against Stephen, who was both handsome and charming, qualities that would likely endear him to the female jurors. She had planned to stack the jury with women, but now she reconsidered her approach. "I'd wish you good luck next time, but that wouldn't be honest," she told Stephen, trying to hide her satisfaction. "Well, I got what I needed. See you next month," he replied, looking annoyingly confident. Linda silently vowed to do whatever it took to win. As the trial began, Linda found herself frustrated. Stephen had used the 5-week delay wisely, leveraging his client's wealth to hire top-notch experts who countered every piece of evidence she presented. The case hinged on whether Stuart Peabody Whitmore's death was murder or suicide. He had been found in the family barn with a bullet to the head from a Colt 1911, a gun only he and Samantha, his wife, could access. There was no suicide note and no clear motive. Linda argued that Stuart had been having an affair with a much younger woman and had withdrawn $2 million from a family trust, likely to give to his mistress. She believed Stuart had called Samantha to ask for a divorce, and in a fit of rage, Samantha had shot him in the barn after a heated argument over the missing check. Linda began her case by telling the jury about the missing check, suggesting Samantha had destroyed it in anger. But as the trial progressed, she noticed how the jury, particularly the women, were captivated by Stephen. His charm and grace made it hard for anyone to resist him. Linda had carefully selected 4 black men for the jury, hoping they would side with the prosecution, especially with Judge Grant's obvious dislike for the defense lawyer. However, Stephen turned the judge's disdain into an advantage, portraying himself as the underdog and winning over the jurors. Despite her best efforts, Linda felt the trial slipping away from her, thanks to Stephen's clever tactics and the jury's growing affection for him. She reminded herself that Stephen was not just a charming lawyer but a cunning one, and she had to stay focused to counter his every move. Linda couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Stephen Fitzgerald, known as Foxy, had transformed himself into the underdog, a poor boy from a tough neighborhood fighting against a wealthy judge. Even the men on the jury were rooting for him. Linda adjusted her shoes, feeling the discomfort, and realized she was now in an unfamiliar position. Normally, she played the underdog, but Foxy had flipped the script. She knew she needed help, and so she called on her last resort, Elizabeth Martin, known as Beth. Beth, a young nurse, had met the wealthy Stuart Peabody Whitmore at the hospital where she worked. He was 55, she was 28. Their relationship had quickly turned into a secret romance, and Beth was deeply attached to him, though she despised his wife, Samantha. Linda knew Beth was a risky witness, but she had prepped her well, ensuring she was ready to face the defense. During questioning, Foxy began by addressing her as Beth, catching her off guard. "Yes, and I believe they call you Foxy," Beth replied, throwing him off balance for the first time in the trial. Linda hadn't rehearsed this with Beth, but she had mentioned Foxy's nickname enough times to make an impression. The courtroom chuckled, and Foxy shot Linda a disappointed look. As Foxy guided the jury through Beth's story, he painted Stuart as a good man trapped in a difficult situation, and Beth as a naive young woman caught in a web of emotions. He skillfully made the jury sympathize with Beth's predicament, framing her as someone who was genuinely cared for by Stuart, despite the affair. Linda, however, pushed back, questioning Beth on whether she truly believed what they were doing was wrong. Beth hesitated, admitting that while people said it was wrong, it felt right to her. Foxy then turned to the jury, highlighting Stuart's promise to always care for Beth, a promise he had made on the last day of his life. As Foxy subtly implied that Stuart's actions were those of a man in turmoil, Beth broke down, sobbing as she confessed that she believed Samantha had taken Stuart's life. The jury watched as Samantha sat motionless, tears streaming down her face, while Foxy stood by Beth's side, gently comforting her. The trial continued for 3 more days, but Linda felt defeated. The jury had seen the love Stuart had for his mistress and the $2 million he had given her before his death. Foxy's final move was to recite a poem, Richard Cory, which captured the essence of a man who seemed to have everything yet ended his own life. The poem left a haunting impression on the jury, reinforcing the notion that even those who appear to have it all can be overwhelmed by inner demons. In the end, Linda knew that despite her efforts, Foxy had managed to sway the jury with his clever tactics and emotional appeal, leaving her with the sinking feeling of a battle lost. That's how Foxy Fitzgerald ended his case before the jury, quoting Edwin Arlington Robinson's poem with a casual shrug. The jury deliberated for 2 long days before finally delivering a not guilty verdict. As Foxy received a quick, awkward hug from his client, he quietly tried to exit the courtroom. Linda Siegel, noticing this, approached him. "If we go out through the jury room, there's a hallway that leads to the back. It goes to the detention area and where the prisoners enter," she offered. "Thank you," he replied, visibly weary. "The cameras are giving me a headache, and I'm feeling a bit sick." He paused to grab the black and white notebook he had guarded throughout the trial, never letting it out of his sight. Linda had often wondered what secrets it held, but she led him through the back of the courtroom, down a long hallway to an elevator, and then to a back staircase that opened into a small, nearly empty parking lot. Without stopping, Linda walked toward her red Miata. "Come on, I'll give you a ride," she said, swaying her hips as she walked, knowing he was watching. She hadn't won the case, but she felt she deserved a small reward. In the car, she asked, "Want to grab some dinner?" "I'm not feeling great," he replied. "You should have some chicken soup. It will help your stomach." "I know a place that makes the best," she said, driving through the security gate and onto the road, not noticing the other car that followed them. 20 minutes later, she parked in front of a group of garden apartments. "Is there a restaurant here?" he asked, No, it's my apartment. My grandmother's chicken and dumpling soup. Come on, you really need it, she insisted. The apartment was small and practical, reflecting Linda's no-nonsense approach to life. As they sat down to eat, she asked, "So how does it feel to help guilty people?" "Is that what we're going to talk about?" "I can't discuss that," he replied. "I thought we were just two people for a second, but you're right. We're lawyers," she said with a sigh. "Surely we can talk about something else at dinner," he suggested. "Of course," she replied, moving behind him and leaning in close. "For instance, how many times do you think we can be together?" she whispered. The next morning, the sunlight woke Linda. She always arranged the bedroom curtains to let the sun shine on her side of the bed, giving her a moment of peace before the day began. She quietly got out of bed, careful not to wake Stephen, and after a shower and some makeup, she checked to see if he was still asleep before heading to the kitchen to make breakfast. Stephen Fitzgerald had been an intriguing and special partner, unhurried and considerate, though Linda sometimes wondered if he would ever truly finish what they had started. Despite her initial nervousness about being involved with a married man, she had found herself drawn to him, even as she thought of his wife, Susan Singleton, who had a strong reputation and presence. As she walked through the living room, she suddenly stopped. On the end table sat the black and white notebook. She glanced back at the bedroom door. Stephen was still asleep. She knew she shouldn't open it, that it wasn't right, but curiosity got the better of her. Promising herself just a quick peek, she opened the notebook. His handwriting was the neatest she had ever seen, clear and precise, with a slight tilt to the left. "Oh my gosh," she whispered, startled by what she found. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Stephen's soft voice interrupted her. Caught off guard, Linda felt dizzy, her hands trembling as the book slipped from her fingers. He wrapped his arms around her and gently helped her sit down. She could only gaze into his deep blue eyes, feeling completely exposed. "I'll make some tea," he said, his voice calm. When he returned, he took the notebook back and handed her a warm mug of tea. "Some things are better left unknown," he said gently. Linda took a sip of tea, then reached out to hold his hand. "Thank you. I'm not sure how I can repay you," she said softly. "It's just a cup of tea," he replied with a faint smile. "Don't say that. You saved me and Samantha Whitmore. I couldn't have handled it alone," Linda said, her voice trembling. "I was just doing my job, like you did yours," Stephen replied. Linda stared down at her tea, watching the ripples from her trembling hands. "No, I was just trying to win, no matter what. I didn't think about the consequences. You did something incredible. I brought you a mess, and you solved it. I was so close to losing," she admitted, tears welling up. "Well, I've never seen this before. Usually I'm the one feeling down the next morning," he joked, trying to lighten the mood. Linda chuckled, but quickly grew serious again. "But why? Was it love?" There were kids involved, grown up now, but still. "She could have ended up in jail for a long time," she said, her voice full of emotion. Stephen didn't have an easy answer. His expression revealed the weight of the case. Yes, Samantha had won, but it came at the cost of keeping the Whitmore family secret buried. She had risked everything for it. "How did you figure it out?" she asked softly. "It was clear if you looked closely. You were too focused on the drama, the lovers, the media frenzy, to see the truth. Married men don't usually get killed by their wives over affairs with younger women. It's often something deeper," he explained. "But it doesn't seem worth it," Linda replied. "His mother got involved with someone else, had a child, and now both parents are gone. What was the point?" "You still don't understand. Stuart Peabody Whitmore Sr. wasn't who everyone thought he was. Stuart Jr. was the child of a stable worker. That truth haunted him until the end. He wrote it down in a letter meant for Samantha, but she burned it to protect the family name. She was the good wife, keeping the secret intact. Love makes us do foolish things," Stephen said. "Both big and small," Linda added, completing the thought. She stepped into his embrace. "Let's make him feel better this morning," she suggested. 2 hours later, Stephen was on a train heading north. His phone buzzed with a dozen missed calls, including 3 messages from Susan. The first expressed frustration that he had avoided the cameras again. The second said she had arranged for him to be interviewed on the morning news. The third asked where he was, her tone tinged with doubt and jealousy. Stephen sat quietly on the train, watching the Hudson River flow south. As steady as the river, life was about to change in ways he couldn't control. He took a deep breath and let the gentle motion of the train lull him into sleep. "Happy Christmas, Tony Greco," Susan DeVoe Singleton said as she walked into the red room of the Capitol building. A small lunch had been arranged for the governor's close team in Albany. While the main office Christmas party was set for the following Sunday in Manhattan, the Albany team had decided to have their own celebration. Susan had come to be polite, bringing chocolates from Cruz's confectionery. Tony greeted her immediately, making it impossible for her to avoid him. She had been dodging him for days, trying to sidestep his persistent marriage proposal. "I can't serve you any alcohol, rules and all, but the food's great," Tony said. "I'm fine. Just wanted to wish everyone happy holidays." "Is the governor here?" Susan asked. "He's in a meeting with the speaker, but he'll stop by later. He's heading to the city tonight. I'll be here until tomorrow. Want to grab a drink later?" Tony suggested. Susan had heard rumors that the speaker was stepping down, with Jose Martin Perez, leader of the influential Black and Hispanic groups, likely to take over. Kincaid didn't support Perez, but it seemed inevitable. "Sorry, I have another Christmas party at the Fort Orange Club for Stephen's law firm," she replied. "Do you really have to go? You know how these law firms are," Tony said. "They're considering making him a partner after his recent success. I need to be there," she explained, holding back her frustration. The truth was, she feared losing Stephen and needed to reinforce her role as Mrs. Stephen Fitzgerald, especially with the rumors of his infidelity. Carrie Wilson, the governor's assistant, then approached, saving Susan from the conversation. "Happy holidays and thanks for coming. I know you're busy," Carrie said, guiding Susan to meet more of the governor's team. "Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate the introductions. I really want to meet everyone," Susan replied, grateful for the distraction. "Tony was going to introduce you, but it seems you've already caught his attention," Carrie said with a smile. "I suppose I have," Susan laughed lightly, though the weight of the situation still lingered. Carrie smiled sympathetically. "If only we all had problems like that." "Be careful what you wish for, girl," Susan laughed lightly. "You're right," Carrie replied. "I don't think I want to be a married woman, especially not when it comes to saying no to Tony's marriage proposal." Susan was taken aback that Carrie knew about Tony's proposal, but Carrie quickly reassured her, "Don't worry, he only told me and I won't say anything. He can be a big-headed jerk sometimes, but I guess that's part of his charm." Carrie wasn't really close to Tony, but as a co-worker, they got along. The problem was Tony wasn't thinking clearly when it came to Susan. His ego had always been large, and he was used to getting what he wanted, especially with women drawn to his looks and charm. Carrie worried that Susan, who was married and too good for Tony, would end up hurt. Their conversation was interrupted when the governor arrived, shifting everyone's attention. Later, Tony managed to corner Susan in his small office. "You told Carrie Wilson about your plan?" Susan asked, clearly upset. "Yes, I wanted her opinion on how the governor might react," Tony replied. "And what did she say?" "She thought it was a bad idea." "She's right. It's a terrible idea. I'm married, Tony. Don't you see that makes what you want impossible? I don't understand why you won't just leave him. It's the 21st century and we live in New York. You don't need a reason anymore." "But I'm Catholic, Tony. My family would never accept it, and besides, what about the governor? How would your proposal to a married woman look when he's launching a presidential campaign? It would be a disaster." "I care about you." "I care about you too, Tony, but what we have is special because it's not everything. Don't ruin it. We can continue like this, but there's one thing you need to know." Susan hesitated, then added, "I promised my mother I would have a child someday. I'm stopping my birth control at the end of this month. I hope to be pregnant in 2 or 3 months." "Are you serious? You want to have his baby?" "I'm his wife, Tony. It has to happen eventually," she replied, not mentioning her real motive, to end any potential threats to her marriage from other women. Stephen would never abandon a pregnant wife. Tony grabbed her by the arms, pulling her close. "You must be crazy if you think I'm going to let you leave me to have his baby. Please, you're hurting me, Susan said, trying to pull away just as the door opened and Carrie Wilson entered. Tony, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the governor wants to see you before he leaves, Carrie said. Tony hesitated, torn between staying with Susan and attending to the governor. The governor's call won out and he left in a rush. Carrie stayed behind. Are you okay? She asked Susan. Yes, but he scared me for a second, Susan replied. I'm sure he wouldn't harm you, but it might be best if you weren't here when he returns, Carrie suggested, unsure of Tony's unpredictability where Susan was concerned. You're right, Susan agreed and left. Carrie watched her go, considering whether she should tell the governor about the brewing trouble within his team. Later at the Fort Orange Club, Susan played the role of the charming, supportive wife, sticking close to Stephen's side. As soon as Stephen went to get more drinks, she seized the opportunity to talk to Mark Tolan, the managing partner of Stephen's firm. This party is fantastic, she complimented him. Tolan, pleased with the praise, smiled. The Fort Orange Club knows how to host a celebration. I made sure the partners covered this. It shows we're the leading law firm in the Capital District. I just wish the governor could have joined us. I'm sure he would have if he could, but he's incredibly busy these days. Susan hinted at Kincaid's presidential ambitions. Yes, I understand. He couldn't have chosen anyone better than you to support him. Thank you, but tonight I'm just Stephen Fitzgerald's wife, she replied, steering the conversation back to her husband. Of course, Stephen's our newest star, the latest partner at Rosewood and Associates. I hope the cost to join wasn't too much for you, Tolan remarked. Susan was well aware of how partnership payments worked. If she hadn't been married to Stephen, he would have struggled to afford the $250,000 buy-in. The firm allowed him to pay in installments over 2 years, deducting it from his paychecks. Once a partner, Stephen wouldn't receive a regular salary, relying instead on the firm's earnings, controlled by Tolan and the firm's accountant, to determine his income. Susan understood the importance of securing Stephen's position and knew that their future financial stability depended heavily on how well the firm did in the years to come. Dear Mark, you don't think we rely on Stephen's income for our living expenses, do you? Susan asked with a polite smile. Well, no, I didn't think so, Tolan replied, sensing where the conversation was heading. But I hope the financial arrangements for Stephen's partnership haven't caused you any trouble. I wouldn't mind, Susan continued, as long as my husband's income is, let's say, reasonable. It would be quite awkward to find ourselves short on funds by next December and have to ask my father for a loan. Tolan understood her concern. Many of his colleagues often fought for a bigger share of the firm's profits, sometimes even earning more than they should, and having to return some of it the following year. Thanks to Stephen's success with the Hamilton case, it was expected to be a profitable year. Most partners were already planning to ask for a larger share at the upcoming January meeting, but he also knew that Susan expected her husband to stick to a strict budget, a reasonable request. Modesty might work, as long as Stephen doesn't mind, Tolan said, aware he couldn't afford to upset such an important source of income. Oh, don't worry, Stephen doesn't understand financial matters. He won't notice any change unless you tell him. But look, here he comes without drinks, that's all for now. As Stephen returned with their drinks, he was feeling out of place, much like the younger employees stuck at a party with their older colleagues. But he wasn't young anymore, and he certainly didn't feel it. He knew Susan was up to something, always planning. He cared for her deeply, often finding her schemes amusing, even though she was incredibly smart. However, there were aspects of life she didn't fully grasp. While Susan was sharper than him in many ways, she lacked his subtlety. Stephen was well aware that Susan wasn't entirely loyal. It was almost expected for a woman as beautiful and socially prominent as her to seek out romance beyond their marriage. Famous actresses often changed partners frequently, yet some men remained devoted to one woman for years. Stephen believed the pressures of society were particularly harsh on women like Susan, who lived in a world where traditional notions of right and wrong were blurred. Her high status and wealth insulated her from the usual consequences of infidelity, but it also placed her in an environment where such behavior was seen more as a social misstep than a moral failing. Despite her flaws, Susan was a good person within her social class. She was generous, hardworking and driven to succeed. She didn't indulge in drugs or excessive drinking, and she ensured that her husband had everything he needed. If not for her jealousy, she would be admired by everyone. But Stephen was acutely aware of her jealousy, and it was a constant source of tension between them. Stephen loved Susan deeply, not just for her looks but for who she was inside. He had always struggled to connect with women, especially those who lacked shared interests. He knew he was one of those good-looking men who could be quite dull. His shyness, particularly around women, only added to his difficulties. His real passion lay in the courtroom, where he could express his creativity as a lawyer, writer, and actor. Susan was the first woman he had ever felt truly comfortable with, and he had remained faithful to her until recently. He still couldn't fully understand what it was about Linda Siegel, the young prosecutor, that had broken down his defenses. From the moment he saw her, he felt an inexplicable pull towards her. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was a deeper connection between two like-minded individuals. They were two sides of the same coin, and when they were together, everything felt natural. They could talk for hours about trial strategies, laughing at each other's stories. Linda was entirely dedicated to her work, and Stephen knew without being told that her social life was just a series of brief, unimportant encounters. The courtroom was her world, and winning was all that mattered. When Linda realized how wrong she had been about the Whitmore case and how much she had deceived herself, she nearly lost control. Stephen felt a strange bond with her as she struggled with her guilt, perhaps because he was grappling with his own. That connection might have been why he gave in to her charms, even though he knew Susan was beginning to notice something was wrong. Stephen was troubled by his infidelity. Part of him tried to justify it, knowing Susan had her own secrets, but deep down, it didn't sit right with him. Love had always been a complicated part of his life. Female secretaries and clients smiled at him, court clerks teased him playfully, and some men looked at him in ways that made him uncomfortable, a look that sent a shiver down his spine and left him feeling unsettled. Stephen Fitzgerald knew deep down that juggling two women was beyond him. Meanwhile, Susan had always struggled with jealousy. Like many who stray in relationships, she enjoyed her freedom, but couldn't bear the thought of her husband having the same. Despite her beauty, she carried a deep-seated fear of being left alone, and the idea of Stephen with another woman was unbearable to her, even as she found it hard to give up her own extramarital interests. It's a strange contradiction, how a woman who enjoys the attention of many men often expects exclusivity from her partner, while some who desire a monogamous relationship might accept a partner with wandering eyes. Stephen had let Susan down, and while she wasn't entirely sure of his infidelity, she was certainly suspicious. Lately, she had been doing everything she could to keep him close, limiting his time alone, away from work, driven by the fear of losing him. "Is something the matter?" Stephen asked, noticing her unease. "Not at all. Why would anything be wrong?" Susan replied, her voice steady, but he could sense something was off. "You seem a bit troubled," he pressed. She couldn't tell him that earlier that day, someone had crossed a line with her. It wasn't the first time a man had been overly aggressive, but this time was different. Tony wasn't just any man. He was a key supporter of the governor. She didn't want to upset him, but she also couldn't allow him to hurt her. "I was speaking with Mark Tolan about your future earnings," she said, masking her real worries. "Oh, is that an issue? We never relied on my income before." "That's true, and I don't want you to worry about it now. I'll make sure everything is okay. Remember how much I love my wonderful husband," she said, leaning down to kiss him. "Hey, save it for later, you two. This is a family-friendly event," said Laura Sullivan, interrupting them with a smile. Stephen smiled back and asked, "Is Pat here?" referring to Laura's husband. "Sorry, he's not here," she replied. "I'm here with Frank Patterson from our firm." Stephen's smile faded. He knew Patterson's reputation, and not just from rumors. His wife didn't know the full story, but her sister Mary had been involved with Patterson, leading to the collapse of her marriage. Patterson had faced his own downfall, losing his job and ending up in Albany. Stephen couldn't understand why someone would take such risks, especially with someone who was already married. As Susan and Laura walked away, Stephen felt a pang of unease. He knew Pat well. While he might have overlooked Laura's flirtations before marriage, he wouldn't tolerate them now. Patterson was trouble, relying on his charm more than his skill. Pursuing Laura was the last thing any sensible man would do, and if Patterson got caught, Pat wouldn't take it lightly. In the restroom, Susan asked Laura, "Come on, talk to me. What's on your mind?" "I really need support. Frank's made it clear that if I want to make partner in January, I need to take our relationship to the next level," Laura admitted. "Sounds like you know what you want. But what about Pat?" "He doesn't need to know, and if he finds out, I'll say I did it for us. But he's not like Steven. He gets really angry. I'm scared of how he'll react. Trust me, I've dealt with someone like that today. Show Pat love and care, make him feel secure. If he feels safe, he won't make a fuss. After you've had your fun with Frank, move on quickly. Keeping them around too long gives them ideas." "You seem to have it all figured out," Laura said. "Definitely. It's a big challenge." Just then, Tony Greco, drunk and carrying an invitation meant for the governor, barged into the party. He wasn't too far gone to notice Steven, and he made sure to smile at him. Steven, however, didn't return the gesture. He tolerated Tony but had no interest in pretending to like him. Fortunately, Frank Patterson intercepted Tony before he could reach Steven, redirecting him with talk of political strategies. Susan barely had time to get back to Steven's side before Tony could approach. "Looks like your friend Greco is on a mission," Steven observed, noticing Tony's approach. Susan's face went pale. The last thing she wanted was a confrontation in front of her husband's colleagues. As Tony Greco approached, Susan leaned in and whispered urgently, "Please, I don't want any trouble. Can you give us some space?" Steven hesitated. He knew his wife was ending things with Greco, as she had done with others before. This cycle of breakups was always painful for her, and he had even been approached by some of the men she'd rejected, each trying to make sense of their situation. Steven understood that for a married woman, affairs often ended with a return to her husband. But this time, he sensed that Tony might cause a scene, which could lead to a public embarrassment for Susan, a disaster that could jeopardize her career and reputation. "Please, please don't cause a fuss," Susan pleaded, her voice tinged with desperation. "What do you want me to do?" Steven asked. "Just step away for a moment and let me handle this," she responded. Reluctantly, Steven nodded and walked away, leaving Susan to confront Tony. She hurried over to him. "We need to talk," she said firmly. "Yes, we do," Tony replied, his gaze flicking toward Steven as he walked away. Tony felt a surge of satisfaction, interpreting Steven's departure as a sign of weakness. Susan guided Tony to a quiet corner in the lounge reserved for club members. The evening manager noticed them but didn't intervene, recognizing them as part of the governor's team. Once they were alone, Susan spoke up. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize. I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't want things to end like this." "I don't want that either," Susan replied, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. She knew she had to end things with Tony tonight. "Then see me later," he insisted. "I can't. I'm with my husband." Tony felt the urge to shout, to demand she stop this charade, but he controlled himself. "After this is done, meet me at my place around midnight." "No, let's meet at the Latham Inn at 12:30, she said, calculating how long it would take to get home and find an excuse to leave again. He nodded, leaning in to kiss her, but she gently pulled away. "Not here," she whispered, then quickly returned to the party. When she re-entered the gathering, only a few people noticed her absence. Susan knew that whispers would always follow her, but she had learned to focus on what was openly said rather than the quiet gossip. Steven gently grabbed her arm. "Shall we leave now? I'm feeling tired and I think I've socialized enough for one night." "Let's say our goodbyes first, then we can go." "I'm tired too," she agreed. On the way home, she thought about what to say to Tony later. She wanted to be kind, but knew she had to end things before they went too far. Meanwhile, the Cardinal was enjoying his tea, made perfectly by the new housekeeper. The conversation after dinner with his financial advisor, Monsignor Douglas Morlock, was focused on a delicate issue: money. "Douglas, what are we going to do about Marianne McManus?" the Cardinal asked. "I'm sorry, but she's not willing to cooperate," Douglas replied. "Are you certain she has the file?" the Cardinal pressed. "Nothing is ever completely certain, but it's likely. We know the file was kept in Bishop McManus's safe, which had strong security. The bishop personally showed me the safe when we placed the file there, following our lawyer's advice. When I checked after his passing, the file and some important papers were missing, but all his personal valuables remained. A thief would have taken those, not left them behind. It seems Marianne left the valuables because she knew the true worth was in the papers. "So, this woman wants Thomas's estate?" the cardinal asked, his tone grave. Clearly upset by Marianne McManus's actions, the cardinal listened as Monsignor Morlock explained the situation. "Yes, she has a will that was never filed, documents for the bishop's lands with both Thomas and Marianne McManus's names, and copies of trusts for her kids. It was an old trick, showing the papers to the family without officially recording them. Only one copy existed, kept by the church's representative, Monsignor Morlock. Without it, the family can't prove their claim, and the estate reverts to the church. Marianne got to the safe before we did," Morlock continued, "and she took our file too. We moved it because Father Estes mentioned it in a support group, and our lawyers warned us that if we were subpoenaed, we'd have to hand it over. But you can't surrender what you don't have. So McManus kept it until we could send it to Rome. I had the combination in case something happened to him." The cardinal recognized the error in their plan. They had overlooked Bishop McManus's breach of his vow of celibacy because of his financial contributions. McManus had amassed wealth, partly from his family and largely from managing church properties. His approach to real estate, offering local churches a chance to raise funds before selling properties, had been successful and widely adopted. But McManus also took care of his family, sending his children to top Catholic universities, buying a condo in Florida, and ensuring his wife was well provided for. He believed that after his death, the cardinal would look after his family, with most of the estate going to the church. However, Marianne had other plans, revealing just how much influence she had over him. The calm in the McManus home had been maintained by empty promises, a tactic the church had used for years. Usually they succeeded, but occasionally someone like Marianne McManus would challenge them. "I feel awful. I let you down, and Tom McManus too. I can't believe that woman bested me," Morlock said, defeated. "We underestimated her. We can't let that happen again. We need that file back no matter what. Do you understand?" The cardinal pressed. "Yes, Your Eminence," Morlock replied, anxiety clear in his voice. "And if you can't retrieve it?" the cardinal asked, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Morlock nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Meanwhile, Linda Siegel reflected on her recent job interview with Jake Greenwald at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Despite the apparent opportunity, Linda wasn't excited about moving from the Westchester District Attorney's Office. She had hoped for more, but her dream of becoming a hero prosecutor had dimmed after she nearly sent an innocent woman to jail. When asked why she wanted the new job, she confidently replied, "I'm looking for new challenges. I don't want to be stuck in criminal law." But the real reason was more complicated. Since that near mistake, she had been haunted by doubts, frequently revisiting her notes from Stephen Fitzgerald's trial. Known as Mighty Mouse for her fierce dedication to justice, Linda now struggled with the very sense of certainty that had once defined her. Linda Siegel had earned her Mighty Mouse nickname for a reason. She saw herself as a defender of justice, confident in her strength and abilities. Until now. Her confidence was shaken by two women who had outmaneuvered her, each for different reasons. One was a wife desperate to hide her husband's secret past, tearing up his final note in a bid to protect his memory. The other was a girlfriend willing to forego $2 million, believing it was the right thing to do. Both women loved the same man, and in the end, he let them both down. But Stephen Fitzgerald had seen through it all, not just as a skilled lawyer, but with an intuition that set him apart. Deputy U.S. Attorney Jake Greenwald couldn't resist bringing Linda onto his team, despite the rough end to the Whitmore case. "You're not still upset about losing the Whitmore case, are you?" Jake asked. He saw himself more as an office strategist than a courtroom lawyer, and he knew the U.S. Attorney wanted to strengthen their trial team. Linda, with her strong reputation and connections, seemed like the right fit, despite her recent loss. "No, I accept the jury's decision," Linda replied, though the truth was more complicated. She had been struggling ever since, burdened by the knowledge that she had almost sent an innocent woman to prison. Fitzgerald had outmaneuvered her, understanding the case better than she did, even with only 6 weeks to prepare. "He did a better job. It's really that simple, she admitted. Jake was intrigued. The job you're applying for is in the civil division, dealing with white-collar crime. Our office doesn't have the best track record with financial cases. Linda saw this as the perfect opportunity. It wasn't just about the new challenge, it was about finding clarity in her work, cases that were straightforward without the moral complexities that had recently plagued her. And it meant she wouldn't have to see Stephen Fitzgerald again, which was a relief given their complicated relationship. Linda had never been one for serious relationships, preferring short, casual encounters. But with Stephen, things were different. From the moment she first saw him alone in the courtroom, she felt a connection she couldn't explain. They shared a passion for their work as trial lawyers, and she found comfort in his presence, even outside the courtroom. Their time together felt special, almost as if they belonged together, except he was married. His wife, Susan, was everything Linda wasn't, charming, wealthy, and unapologetically unfaithful. This infuriated Linda. How could such a woman have the man she believed should be hers? Despite the distance between them and the challenges of maintaining their relationship, Linda held on to hope. She dreamed that one day, Stephen would leave his wife and choose her instead. As she prepared to start her new job at the U.S. Attorney's Office, Linda allowed herself to dream of a future with Stephen. She planned to move closer to the city, ready to embrace her new life and the possibility that Stephen might join her someday. For now, she was waiting for the day when he would move on from the woman she called the bitch and finally be hers. Meanwhile, Stephen Fitzgerald sat in his new office at Rosewood and Associates, contemplating the choices that had led him to this point. Stephen Fitzgerald had recently moved into his new office as a full partner at the law firm. Although it wasn't the largest or most prestigious office, it symbolized his rise within the firm, bypassing the usual steps of senior associate or junior partner. The firm wanted his well-known name on the door to attract clients, but Stephen quickly realized that while his courtroom victories brought attention, they didn't generate the real profits. Deals and settlements did. Feeling like a show horse trotted out only to impress clients, Stephen grew bored and isolated in his new role. The other lawyers either resented his sudden rise or were too intimidated to engage with him. His new assistant, Patty Stanton, seemed equally unenthused, reflecting the general atmosphere of the firm. One day, Patty informed him of a call from someone named Jason Applewood, who claimed to know him from St. Ignatius. Stephen didn't recall anyone by that name, but decided to take the call. The moment Jason mentioned Father Danbury, a chill ran down Stephen's spine. He agreed to meet Jason at a nearby sandwich shop. 20 minutes later, Jason Applewood, looking older than his years, entered the shop. Stephen noted his nervousness as they sat down. After some small talk, Jason began to share his story. A painful account of abuse at the hands of Father Danbury, which had left lasting scars. Jason revealed that Stephen was known to have been one of Danbury's last victims, a fact they had uncovered through their investigations. "We need justice, Stephen. The others and I, we're united now, but we need your help. You're a respected lawyer, and we believe you can lead a legal case against those who allowed this to happen," Jason said, his voice trembling with emotion. Stephen listened without revealing his thoughts. "What exactly do you need from me?" he asked. Jason explained that they hoped Stephen could help them navigate the legal system. Despite the statute of limitations having expired, they believed they had a way to overcome it. But Stephen, ever the lawyer, pointed out the challenges. The time limit is 3 years, starting from when the victim turns 18. For someone like you at 29, that window closed 8 years ago. The state assembly tried to extend it, but the Senate blocked it. The politicians don't want this to go to court. Jason nodded, understanding the difficulties but undeterred. "We think we've found a way to challenge the time limit, but we need someone like you, someone who knows the system and has the name to make people listen." Stephen leaned back, considering the request. "And who exactly are you?" he asked, needing to know more about the man in front of him and the group he represented. The New York Alliance of Abuse Victims, NYAAV, had approached Stephen Fitzgerald with a desperate plea for help. They believed they had uncovered new evidence, not of recent crimes, but of a conspiracy to cover up old ones. The conspiracy allegedly involved lawyers, police officers, prosecutors, judges, and even state politicians, all working together to hide the truth about the abuse inflicted by Father Danbury. "Do you have this evidence?" Stephen asked. "No, but we know it exists," Jason Applewood replied. "A trusted source saw the file, a file with names, dates, and details of how the cover-up was orchestrated. This source shared everything with us before he died." Stephen's skepticism grew. "You want to sue based on this alleged file, which you don't even possess? What's the last action they took to keep this cover-up going?" Jason hesitated. "Father Estes told us before he passed that the cover-up is still ongoing. They're still paying off officials to keep everything quiet." Stephen prepared to leave, dismissing the conversation as futile. But when Jason mentioned reaching out to Patrick Sullivan, Stephen paused. He knew Pat, an honorable man who had once stood up to Father Danbury as a boy and suffered greatly for it. Stephen couldn't let Pat get dragged into this without some guidance. "All right, I'll help," Stephen finally said, "but on two conditions. You and your group stay away from Pat Sullivan, and you follow my instructions to the letter." Jason eagerly agreed, relieved to have Stephen on board. Stephen sent him back to Manhattan with instructions to gather his group in a safe place and wait for further orders. As Jason boarded the train, Stephen felt an odd sense of relief, as if a long-buried weight had begun to lift. Meanwhile, Jimmy O'Reilly, a defense lawyer and former special prosecutor, was reading a legal brief he had received from the governor of New York. The brief was masterfully written, outlining a potential legal strategy to bypass the statute of limitations by arguing that the clock on the time limit should only start when the cover-up was discovered, not when the abuse occurred. The brief was brilliant, but O'Reilly knew it missed a key point. The real opportunity often lay not in winning a case, but in what could be gained through the broader implications of a legal failure. The real problem wasn't the initial attack, but the cover-up that followed. This case was complex, with strong legal arguments, making it a prime study for law students and likely to attract significant attention if the highest court reviewed it. O'Reilly believed current laws wouldn't help the victims, who were children at the time, and the High Court might dismiss the case as too late. However, the memo highlighted that the trial might proceed before an appeal, creating public and governmental unease. O'Reilly imagined the trial vividly. The plaintiff's lawyers would recount the boy's suffering, then bring in Stephen Fitzgerald, who'd recount being injured at 11 while delivering a cake. They'd describe the boy's struggle with a priest, where Sullivan defended himself with a crucifix. The plaintiffs would reveal the mistreatment the boys faced from adults meant to protect them, police, lawyers, and judges, leading to lasting damage and potential legal fallout for those involved. The cardinal had hinted that crucial evidence might be hidden, and the governor's office tasked O'Reilly, an outsider, with uncovering it. O'Reilly's investigation led him to a hidden criminal record of Sullivan, revealing it was a minor charge, but with deeper implications involving Edward Kincaid, a well-known defense lawyer whose involvement suggested a broader conspiracy. Much of the record was missing, but O'Reilly suspected someone with ties to the church might use the information to their advantage. Carrie Wilson from the governor's office called, revealing the governor was unaware of the scandal involving his father. This angered her, but O'Reilly remained skeptical, noting his own trust issues and complex personal life. His relationship with Carrie was strained, as she was engaged to a man using her to hide his sexuality, while O'Reilly struggled with his own marital problems and distrust in the governor. Jimmy O'Reilly was inherently distrustful, and the case he was working on seemed to implicate not just the governor, but also other influential figures. His skepticism about politicians, including Governor Edward Kincaid, made him wary. "I'll stay hopeful until I can't," Jimmy told Carrie. She urged him to believe in people, but he couldn't shake the thought that the young abuse victims had been led to distrust too. Susan Fitzgerald Singleton was in a difficult position. Despite her sister Mary's recommendation, she had never considered hiring a private investigator before. Mary had warned Susan not to be fooled by the name Hartman and Hartman. The firm was just Teresa Hartman, an exceptional but unassuming detective. Susan, sitting high in her chair, met Teresa's steady gaze. "I suspect my husband is being unfaithful. I need to know for sure and how serious it is," Susan explained. Teresa, a calm woman in her 50s, assured Susan that finding out about her husband's infidelity wouldn't be difficult, but understanding the seriousness would depend on the woman involved. She mentioned it might be costly, but Susan was willing to pay whatever it took. At a strategy meeting at the Boulevard Inn, Stephen Fitzgerald, a lawyer and abuse survivor, addressed a skeptical crowd. The meeting was crowded with both supporters and spies from various groups, including the Church and the Vatican. Stephen's comments about proof and the file were met with hostility, but he suspected surveillance and was careful not to reveal too much. When a prominent woman in her 60s, Silver Keenan, asked Stephen what he suggested, he proposed searching public records for proof of the plan he believed existed. The meeting ended with a decision to postpone further discussions until the next month. As the crowd dispersed, Silver approached Stephen, revealing her tragic connection. Her son Jeff had taken his own life 3 years prior. After his death, I discovered that my brother had been abused by 2 priests for 6 years. In seeking justice, I found there was none in this state for victims, which led me to help start this group. Thank you for coming and for your honesty about your plans, Sylvia said to Stephen, noticing his frown. You're good at telling stories. Most believe you, but not everyone. Stephen knew that the fewer people he deceived, the better. Jimmy O'Reilly, however, was not deceived. Tara's report indicated that Fitzgerald was closing in. Jimmy began by listing prominent church leaders who had left their roles due to illness or retirement, as they might know about the missing file. Initial searches for break-ins and recent deaths proved unhelpful, but 2 cases stood out. Monsignor Robert Montgomery, who died at a wealthy friend's house, and Bishop McManus, who had been ill and worked with Edward Kincaid Sr. Jimmy, decided to question Cecilia Porter, who had been close to Montgomery, and Marianne McManus. Cecilia, though hesitant, denied having any papers from Montgomery. The neighbors gossip, she insisted. The O'Reilly agency had uncovered Cecilia's past, revealing that she had a questionable history and was not as respectable as she seemed. Cecilia had married Randy Porter while pregnant by another man and had used her connections for financial gain. As the years passed, the Porters became connected with Montgomery, who had a generous pension from the church. Cecilia, now older, lived comfortably in a Westchester home bought with Montgomery's financial help. I could subpoena you, Cecilia, but I'd rather not. I need to find stolen records for my investigation, Jimmy said. Cecilia, visibly uncomfortable, finally produced a ledger from Montgomery. It contained a detailed account of deposits and withdrawals, but no clear evidence of the missing file. Jimmy looked through the ledger for any clues, but found nothing significant. Is there anything else? Perhaps another file? Jimmy asked. Cecilia remained silent, leaving the mystery unresolved. No, there's nothing. Please leave me alone, Cecilia said, clearly frustrated. Jimmy nodded, glanced at the book on the table, and left. Linda arrived at the Midtown Marriott, thrilled to avoid the train ride back to Westchester. Stephen had given her the room key earlier, and they had plans for dinner and a night together. She showered, dressed in a new light pink teddy, and applied her favorite Chanel perfume. After turning on CNN, she dozed off. She awoke to Stephen gently kissing her, his skin warm and smelling of hotel soap. Wake up, sleepyhead. It's almost time for dinner, and I want to be close to you, he said. Linda playfully protested, but soon they were engaged in an intimate moment before room service arrived. Meanwhile, Teresa Hartman, who had followed Stephen from his meeting, saw the room service cart but missed Linda's arrival. She decided to set up a small camera in the hallway to monitor the hotel room's activity, noting that Stephen was being watched by at least 2 other people. Inside the room, Stephen watched Linda enjoy her steak. "You've never seen a woman eat before?" she joked. "I've never seen anyone eat like you," he replied. Their conversation shifted to his wife, Susan. Linda demanded clarity about his intentions, pressing for a serious answer. Stephen responded, "Linda, I'm here because I choose to be." Elsewhere, Susan Singleton stayed with her friend Laura Sullivan, discussing her recent divorce. "I can't believe he kicked you out," Susan said, shocked by Laura's situation. Laura revealed that her ex-husband had tricked her, setting up her boyfriend Frank Patterson for a DUI to force a divorce. Frank, already vulnerable due to past charges, had been manipulated by Laura's ex, Pat, using alcohol-laced drinks to ensure Frank's arrest and job loss. Patrick's actions against Laura were ruthless. He handed her divorce papers and demanded she sign to protect her partner. Despite her pleas and explanations about her past affairs, Laura had no choice but to comply, hoping Pat would cool down. With her job on the line, thanks to Frank's anger, Saul Solomon helped her retain it. Laura now worked hard to save her marriage and mend the situation, feeling responsible for her husband's actions. Susan was stunned by Pat's behavior and Stephen's indifference. Saul suggested counseling, but Laura dismissed it, believing Pat clung to outdated views on love. Susan shared her doubts about Stephen, questioning whether he might be unfaithful. Laura defended Stephen, insisting that good men don't cheat for fun. Susan agreed, acknowledging that even if she had crossed boundaries, it didn't justify Stephen's potential infidelity. Laura lamented her own mistakes and Pat's anger, realizing too late the extent of his vindictiveness. Susan promised to investigate Stephen's loyalty thoroughly and address any issues. Meanwhile, Stephen was aware of being watched. He had booked 2 adjacent hotel rooms, one under his name and one through his law firm, giving Linda access to the latter. As he planned his next moves, he knew he had to navigate these challenges carefully, leveraging his resources and connections. At the City Line bar, Tony, a regular, enjoyed the cool September afternoon, reflecting on the bar's transformation from a college hangout to a more upscale venue, symbolizing the changes in the city and its people. Tony sat at the bar, nursing a beer and munching on buffalo wings while the Yankees faltered against the Red Sox on the big TV. He felt the sting of Susan's absence deeply. Their relationship had become a topic of speculation, though unspoken. Tony had fallen for Susan, convinced of his love, but her rejection cut him deeply. He had ignored warnings about proposing and underestimated her commitment to her husband Fitzgerald, whom Tony deemed unworthy. Susan's devotion to her marriage was clear, even if it didn't align with Tony's view of fidelity. Tony was struggling to accept that Susan's choice was not about him, but about her values. Meanwhile, he felt humiliated and betrayed, especially knowing she was with Fitzgerald, whom he viewed as weak. As Tony sat brooding, Frank Patterson slid into the chair next to him. Frank, known for his charm and political maneuvering, was not someone Tony trusted. Frank's shady dealings were well known, and Tony viewed him as an opportunist. Despite Frank's outward friendliness, Tony saw through his facade. Their conversation soon turned to Stephen Fitzgerald. Frank's casual inquiry about Mrs. Fitzgerald's devotion stirred Tony's bitterness. The discussion veered into a darker territory, hinting at a shared interest in removing Fitzgerald from the picture. As they sipped their beers and discussed their mutual disdain for Fitzgerald, Tony and Frank's conversation lingered on the idea of removing obstacles in their paths. In the background, the game continued, a distant distraction from the more pressing matters at hand. In Cobble Hill, Jimmy O'Reilly surveyed the flat, familiar landscape. The McManus home, part of a row of solid houses facing a small park, stood as a testament to stability in a neighborhood marked by its calm demeanor and reliable community. The McManus home, a stately residence with 3 floors and an English-style basement, had been converted into small, upscale apartments. Yet the McManus family still occupied the top floors. On a sunny October afternoon, Jimmy O'Reilly arrived to meet Mary Ann McManus. Mary Ann, a poised woman in her 50s, greeted him warmly. Dressed in a dark blue suit, she exuded elegance and confidence. As she led him to the living room, her graceful demeanor was unexpected. The room was decorated with a mix of Victorian and modern furniture, reflecting years of careful collection. "Please, Mr. O'Reilly, have a seat," she offered, pointing to a leather chair. She then offered him coffee or whiskey. Opting for coffee, Jimmy noted its quality and promised to visit the Italian shop she recommended. "Now let's get to why you're here," Mary Ann said. Jimmy explained he needed certain documents related to a special prosecution case. Mary Ann was skeptical about his request, questioning why he thought she had the documents. "The Archdiocese gave them to Bishop McManus, who has since passed away," Jimmy explained. "I'm trying to trace them through his widow." Mary Ann confirmed she was indeed Tom McManus's widow and mentioned their condo in Florida, where they had lived as a married couple, recognized under state law. Jimmy complimented her, acknowledging he knew of her reputation. Mary Ann was aware of this and revealed she stayed in touch with other women connected to priests, including Cecilia Porter. If you had the documents, you wouldn't give them to me, she said firmly. I've lived in the background of my husband's public life, but I won't be intimidated by you or your threats. Jimmy tried to convince her of the importance of the documents, but was met with her resolve. I have everything I need and have safeguarded it well. I'm prepared for any risk, Marianne said. When Jimmy inquired about Patrick Sullivan and Stephen Fitzgerald, Marianne hinted at a troubling history. She implied that Stephen Fitzgerald, as a boy, had been harmed by a priest, Edward Danbury, connecting him to a larger, painful story. Patrick had helped him during the fight, using a heavy silver cross that cracked Danbury's skull. Sullivan, despite his injuries, was blamed for the attack, which was too severe to be ignored. The truth about Danbury's past, involving over 100 victims, was at risk of being exposed if Sullivan wasn't charged. Sullivan spent 6 months in juvenile detention, but the real issue was who else was involved. Marianne McManus had no intention of revealing these names. Jimmy O'Reilly asked Marianne if it troubled her that her husband was involved. Her response was calm, but she indicated that her husband's connection to the case was more complex than he realized. She hinted at Thomas McManus's links to Edward Kincaid's firm, which handled church real estate deals. Marianne remained firm, suggesting that the impact of revealing these documents would hurt both the innocent and the guilty. Jimmy tried one last time to persuade her, but she remained steadfast, telling him to inform the governor not to worry and assuring him that she was watching over things. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, Susan Singleton Fitzgerald reviewed a report with Teresa Hartman. Teresa sensed Susan's frustration and guilt over her mistakes and her husband's infidelity. Teresa, drawing on her experience, noted that guilty wives are often more forthcoming than faithful ones. Susan, distressed and in tears, questioned her future. Teresa revealed a new concern. Stephen was being watched by several groups, possibly including government agencies, and could be in danger. Susan was shocked. Teresa explained that Stephen's past, involving abuse by the priest Ed Danbury, might be resurfacing. Danbury's case had recently attracted renewed interest, and Stephen's involvement in reopening it had drawn attention. Susan, blindsided by this revelation, wondered why Stephen had kept such a significant part of his past from her, and why it was now a threat. Teresa admitted she only had fragments of the story but promised to investigate further. Susan realized Patrick Sullivan had been involved in saving her husband Stephen from a severe attack by Danbury. Patrick had suffered injuries and ended up in juvenile detention, but his actions deeply affected Stephen. Susan learned that many victims of Danbury's abuse wanted to reopen their cases, hoping Stephen's involvement would help them. Teresa warned that Stephen might be at risk due to his renewed interest in the case, prompting Susan to commit fully to supporting him. Meanwhile, Linda Siegel faced challenges in her new job, feeling undervalued among her more privileged colleagues. The high stakes of her position, combined with student loan debt, left her anxious about her future. Her worries intensified when she was unexpectedly summoned for a private meeting with Nancy Ross Jordan, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. In the meeting, Nancy revealed that Linda's role was not as it seemed. Although Linda was perceived as a talented lawyer, Nancy had hired her specifically because of her connection to Stephen Fitzgerald. Nancy had been tracking Stephen and Patrick Sullivan, intrigued by their complex past and current activities. She mentioned that Sullivan's recent promotion to acting district attorney was part of a troubling pattern of misuse of power. Nancy handed Linda a file with speculative information about Stephen and Patrick, noting that while there was no solid evidence, their actions warranted scrutiny. Nancy's interest in Linda stemmed from her prior knowledge of Stephen, and despite Linda's initial discomfort, Nancy was pleased with her deeper understanding of the situation. If you think this is a problem and want to let me go, I understand. What do you want me to do? I need you to keep an eye on him. The FBI is tightening its rules, and I need someone close to him. Why me? Because your past connection to him could put both of you in danger if things go south. I'm willing to support you and help with your career here. This case could reveal significant corruption. Ultimately, you'll help him because he needs you. Can I think it over? Sure, but I need your decision by tomorrow. Can I take this file? Yes, but keep it locked and confidential. Nancy Ross Jordan sent Linda on her way with a task to consider carefully. At a fancy poolside restaurant, Majority Leader Jose Martin Perez, his wife Emma, counsel to the Majority Ray Emerson, and his fiancée Carrie Wilson dined. The restaurant, known for its high-profile patrons, was currently buzzing with photographers focusing on the group. Emma, a model feeling the pressures of age, and Carrie, who was pretending to be close with Ray, were both maintaining facades. The evening was intended to keep the men's focus off any underlying issues. Carrie, involved in a secret role supporting Governor Kincaid, was feeling the pressure. When Jose inquired about Kincaid's re-election campaign, Carrie deflected, revealing her discomfort with the topic and avoiding mention of Kincaid's rumored presidential run. Jose probed further, asking about the PR consultant Susan Singleton, which made Carrie uneasy. She tried to steer the conversation away, but Jose's questions revealed his awareness of connections between various individuals, including Jimmy O'Reilly. As the dinner ended, Carrie was anxious about the probing questions and the implications of her double life. She later tried to discuss the evening with Emma, who was relaxing with ice cream. Emma, in her fancy pajamas, was uninterested in talking about O'Reilly and Fitzgerald, focusing instead on her own indulgences. "Ask Ray," Emma said, frowning as she continued eating her ice cream. "I only know Fitzgerald upset John, but I don't know more." Carrie, frustrated, pondered whether Assemblyman Martin Perez knew about the governor's problems or was just guessing. She couldn't recall discussing any secrets that might have leaked. The situation seemed convoluted, especially since Jose should be next in line if the governor stepped down. Carrie needed to call the governor and maybe O'Reilly, but decided to wait until morning. Emma wouldn't leave until Ray returned, so Carrie had to endure until then. Meanwhile, at the Cops and Bradley offices on the 40th floor, Susan Singleton and her team discussed plans. Susan would take a year off from her regular work to focus on Kincaid's re-election campaign, while Kincaid's team prepared for a potential presidential run. Tony Greco expected the exploration group to be ready by Christmas. Carrie Wilson, silently noting the meeting details, was worried. Her relationship with Jimmy O'Reilly, who was struggling with a child abuse case, might affect her own career prospects. Susan's focus on the presidential campaign seemed misplaced given the scandal involving the governor's father. Susan was troubled by her recent conversation with Jose Martin Perez, who had insight into her new job and Stephen's important work. She was also uneasy about her secret affair with Tony Greco, feeling the weight of her personal and professional challenges. Susan was anxious about Stephen's safety and feared for their marriage. As the meeting ended, the governor inquired if Susan could join his team by the year's end. Susan agreed, but her colleagues Carrie and Tony appeared displeased. Tony, lingering behind, took Susan's hand and kissed her. "Please, we could get caught," Susan murmured, sensing the tension of their situation. Susan's secretary sometimes barged in without knocking, but it was a weak excuse for avoiding the real issue, Tony said. "When will you accept our feelings?" he demanded. Susan responded firmly, "I'm married and I've promised to stay with Stephen for life. I can't break that vow." Tony's frustration was clear as he stormed out, his resentment for Stephen growing. Carrie saw an opportunity to talk to the governor in the elevator. "I'm worried about Jimmy's role," she admitted. "The majority leader knows he's helping you, and I might have said too much." The governor reassured her, "We've done all we can. It's in Jimmy's hands now. Trust the process." After her meeting with Mr. Greco, Susan called her sister Mary for lunch. Despite their 14-year age gap and differing lives, Susan felt compelled to connect. Mary had been a successful lawyer on Wall Street but was now facing personal turmoil. She had discovered her husband's infidelity and the truth about her daughter's paternity. Meeting at a cozy Greek restaurant, Susan noticed Mary's sadness. "You look as tired as I feel," Susan said. Mary replied, "Jason left me after 20 years and 3 kids. He found out about my affair with Frank Patterson and hasn't returned." Susan probed further, and Mary explained, "Jason's departure followed years of cheating. My last mistake was with Frank Patterson, which led to my ousting from the firm, but I'm not the only one affected. Frank's had trouble with other women's husbands." Mary continued, "Jack Cardigan, my old mentor, was also involved. He's sending help to the governor now. Jack's handling the situation as best he can, trying to spend more time with Tara, the daughter we had together." Susan, troubled, asked, "How do you explain this to Tara?" Mary wiped her eyes and said, I didn't need to. She already knew. It seems my husband was the only one who didn't. Susan held her sister's hand as a waiter arrived, momentarily easing the tension. She reflected on the complexities of broken marriages and the pain of old mistakes. Susan worried if Stephen might react similarly, jeopardizing everything he held dear due to pride and past errors. Was Stephen already seeing someone else? Had she unknowingly driven him away? As the waiter arrived, Mary broke the silence, asking, "How's the baby search going?" Susan sighed. "No luck yet. Stephen's been distant. Mary, you suggested I hire a private investigator. Do you think he's involved with someone?" Mary replied, "Yes, a short lawyer. What could he possibly see in her? She's only 4 feet 7 inches tall." Susan shrugged. "Maybe height doesn't matter to him. Stephen has a strong personality. It's more about my past mistakes." Mary pressed. "Mistakes? How many?" Susan responded, "That's behind me. I've ended things with the last guy. I'm committed to Stephen and want to start a family. I just wish I were already pregnant." Mary handed Susan a card. "This is Evelyn Price Bennett, a top women's health specialist. I found her after you didn't call with good news. You should see her." Susan took the card, realizing it was time to move on from Tony and focus on her future with Stephen. Meanwhile, Patrick Sullivan, despite being behind in the polls, was tirelessly campaigning. At the Polish Community Center, Sheriff Deputy John Brandt took a quick break to chat with locals. Suddenly, he heard a motorcycle revving and took a difficult shot from the steps, hitting the rider and causing the motorcycle to crash into Sullivan. Brandt rushed to Sullivan, who lay motionless on the ground as bystanders dialed 911. News reports later revealed Sullivan lost the election but was hailed a hero. Brandt, upset and feeling careless, learned the suspect was dead and speculation about biker gang revenge began. Sullivan's wife arrived at the hospital, tearful and regretful, but Brandt questioned her sincerity given her past infidelity. The governor, with Kerry Wilson and Tony Greco, visited the hospital. Greco asked Brandt about Sullivan's condition. "He's critical but expected to pull through," Brandt said. The governor, relieved, offered comfort to Sullivan's wife. On Election Day in Syracuse, Jimmy O'Reilly faced a tough bankruptcy case in a sparsely attended federal court. The opposing attorney, a young man from Long Island, did little but take notes. When asked if the bankruptcy judge erred, Jimmy revealed evidence of forged ownership papers. The judge agreed to delay the hearing for further review, knowing the bank would likely fix the issue before the next session. Jimmy O'Reilly was frustrated by the drive from Albany to Syracuse, knowing it was part of the bank's strategy to drag out the process. As he walked from the courthouse to his parked Honda Civic, an SUV pulled up. 2 men, one shorter and one taller, approached him. "Mr. Balzano wants to see you," the shorter man said. Jimmy recognized the name Salvatore Balzano, known as Sal the Lefty from his baseball days. Lefty was a nickname from his Little League days, not his criminal past. The men nodded, acknowledging his knowledge of Balzano. "I'll head over," Jimmy said, but the men insisted on driving him. "My car's at a meter," he added, trying to buy time. "We'll take care of it," the bigger man replied, shoving Jimmy into the SUV. 45 minutes later, they arrived at Johnny's Bar and Grill in Oroscani. The bar looked old and run down. They led Jimmy through the bar, down a long hallway, and into a windowless room marked private. Salvatore Balzano sat behind a simple metal desk. "Good afternoon, Jim," he greeted warmly. "Just call me Sal." Jimmy took a seat as Sal, in his late 60s but still robust, began discussing family matters. Sal praised Jimmy's wife and daughters, then spoke emotionally about his late son, Sal Jr., who had died in Iraq. Sal shifted the conversation to business. He pulled out a tape recorder and played a recording of 2 men discussing traffic between New York and Albany. The conversation seemed mundane at first, but Sal then explained the context. "These men are discussing O'Reilly," Sal said. "My friend's listening device is legal but might be considered overreach. We need to act before the judge notices." He replayed the tape. The first man mentioned that a lawyer named O'Reilly was investigating a missing file. The second man dismissed O'Reilly as insignificant, but the first man was concerned about O'Reilly uncovering troubling information. The second man suggested eliminating O'Reilly if necessary, saying it might cost $2 million, but they might negotiate for more. Sal turned off the tape. My friend's job is to ensure nothing derails our plans. You understand the situation? Jimmy nodded, realizing the danger he was in. Jimmy O'Reilly was already irked by his drive from Albany to Syracuse, which felt like part of the bank's delay tactic. As he walked from the courthouse to his Honda Civic, an SUV pulled up and two men, one short and one tall, approached. "Mr. Balzano wants to see you," said the shorter man. Jimmy recognized Salvatore Balzano, known as Sal the Lefty from his baseball days. Lefty was a nod to his Little League days, not his criminal past. The men confirmed Jimmy's understanding with a nod. "I'll go on my own," Jimmy said, but the men insisted on driving him. "My car's at a meter," he tried to delay. "We'll handle it," the taller man replied, pushing Jimmy into the SUV. 45 minutes later, they arrived at Johnny's Bar and Grill in Orriscani. The place was run down. They guided Jimmy through the bar and down a long hallway to a windowless room marked Private. Salvatore Balzano sat behind a metal desk. "Good afternoon, Jim," he greeted with a warm smile. "Just call me Sal." Jimmy sat as Sal, now in his late 60s but still imposing, talked about family. Sal praised Jimmy's wife and daughters, then spoke emotionally about his late son, Sal Jr., who had died in Iraq. Shifting gears, Sal pulled out a tape recorder and played a recording of two men discussing traffic between New York and Albany. The conversation seemed trivial until Sal explained. "These men are discussing you," Sal said. "My friend's listening device is legal but might be considered overreach. We need to act before the judge catches wind." He replayed the tape. One man discussed O'Reilly's investigation into a missing file and expressed concern about O'Reilly uncovering too much. The second man suggested eliminating O'Reilly if necessary, with a potential cost of $2 million or possibly more. Sal turned off the tape. "You understand the situation now?" Jimmy nodded, fully aware of the danger he faced. Stephen lost Jake at the light but kept running, turning left onto Amity Street. Teresa followed, but Stephen vanished. She carefully checked the empty street and gardens, peering behind parked cars, but he was nowhere to be found. Jake caught up, breathless. "Did we lose him?" he asked. "Yes, but I don't know how," Teresa replied. They retraced their steps, scanning the yards and buildings on both streets, relieved that no one seemed to be following Stephen. Meanwhile, O'Reilly parked his Honda Civic illegally on Congress Street, hoping not to get towed. Exhausted from a long day's drive from Albany to Brooklyn, he hurried to the McManus house, finding the front room lights on but no one inside. He rang the doorbell repeatedly before Stephen Fitzgerald yanked him inside. "Be quiet," Stephen whispered. "What are you doing here?" Jimmy asked. "I was supposed to meet Mary Ann, but something's wrong," Stephen explained, leading Jimmy to a dimly lit office where Mary McManus lay dead. Stephen, wearing dark clothes, revealed he'd entered through the roof. "I grew up around here. It's easy to get in," he said. "I was held up by Sullivan's situation." Jimmy crouched beside Mary, expressing his regret. "I came to tell you we made a mistake." Stephen was puzzled. "Error?" "Long story," Jimmy replied. "Let's find the file." They searched the office but found no file in the open safe. Mary had mentioned a lamp in Matthew 25, the story of the 10 virgins. Stephen led Jimmy outside to a small garden with a statue of the Virgin Mary. A solar-powered light illuminated it. They lifted the statue, revealing a key for a safety deposit box. "Which bank?" Jimmy asked. "The Bank of Commerce on Court Street," Stephen guessed. "She opened a small account there." The two men then discussed getting into the bank. "We need someone to impersonate Mary McManus," Stephen said. "I have a plan. Let's leave first." They exited through the garden, walked down a hidden path, and returned to Congress Street. Jimmy's car was still there, avoiding a parking ticket. They drove in circles to ensure they weren't followed before parking by the river. Jimmy played the tape Lefty Balzano had given him. "I think the men on the tape are Frank Patterson and Anthony Greco," Jimmy said. "Who's behind them?" Stephen asked. "Jose Martin Perez," Jimmy revealed. "He was my lawyer once, probably in the file and knows what happened." Stephen tensed, but confirmed, staring out at the dark river. They fell silent, the gravity of their discovery settling in. Jimmy hesitated, then asked, "Are you going to tell me what really happened?" Stephen stared at the river and began to speak. After school, he'd often ask to meet in the rectory. It felt off, but I didn't realize what he wanted until it was too late. I thought it wouldn't happen again, but the next week I was asked to drop off a cake at a parish bake sale. When I arrived, the hall was empty. It felt like a trap. He grabbed me and pulled me backstage behind the altar. Pat tried to help, but Danbury overpowered him. I grabbed a silver cross and struck Danbury just before Pat got hurt. A woman from the Sacred Heart group heard the commotion and screamed, drawing others in. The police arrived, separated us, and took us to different stations. I was put in a room with no questions asked, given a soda, and told to wait for my parents. A lawyer named John Martin, who worked for legal aid, came to see me. He seemed more interested in something else than helping. My parents took me home, and Pat was put on trial. He admitted hitting Danbury with the cross, but Danbury's injuries and the scandal were kept quiet. I felt responsible for what Danbury did to me. Maybe that's why I became a lawyer. Jimmy asked, "Who was the lawyer for Pat?" The file says Senior Kincaid, but Marianne hinted it might be someone else. Stephen thought for a moment. "The only lawyer I can think of is John Martin. Pat would know for sure. What about the prosecutor?" "I remember a young woman with a tricky name," Jimmy said. "We need that file," Stephen agreed. "But what do we do afterward?" "You'll hand it to the governor," Jimmy said. "But I don't trust him. He might use it for his own gain, leaving the victims to suffer." "I'm sorry I didn't get to tell Pat," Stephen said. "It's okay. Pat would have done things his way anyway," Jimmy replied. "Let's get the file and deal with Patterson and Greco." "All right, I'll handle the file. You take care of them," Stephen said. Meanwhile, Sylvia Keenan, usually confident at 57, felt anxious as she entered Commerce Bank. She approached the young clerk at the desk, holding the key to box 102. "Please sign here and provide 2 forms of ID," he said, barely glancing at her. Sylvia signed in as Marianne McManus and handed over the Social Security card and driver's license Stephen had taken from the McManus house. The clerk didn't scrutinize the photo on the license and returned it along with the Social Security card. Sylvia was ready to argue about the bad photo, but thought better of it. Marianne's license, with its faded picture from the state's high-security system, barely registered with the clerk. He directed her to the vault clerk, who led her to box 102. After placing their keys and retrieving the box, he guided her to a small booth and left. Inside, Marianne felt a sense of relief. The box was nearly full of a red file folder. She took a deep breath, removed the folder, and saw that the box was empty. The temptation to run was strong, but she steadied herself, focusing on the task at hand. The folder contained 5 neatly organized sets of papers and a 3-page index. Marianne knew she had what she came for. She tucked the folder into her bag, replacing it with the heavy, boring book she'd brought in its place. She then called the clerk to return the box and left the bank. Outside, she met Stephen, who had been waiting. "I got it," she said, opening the car door. "They hardly checked anything." Stephen glanced at the folder. "It looks good, but I'm not sure about the updated index," he said. "Thanks for your bravery," he added, squeezing her hand. Marianne gave him a gentle kiss on the cheek, saying, "Please make it matter." Stephen understood her need to find peace and make up for past guilt. He was determined to use this opportunity to set things right, realizing the importance of this moment in his life. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Ed Brandt of the Van Patten County Sheriff's Department observed Pollyanna Randall, the new waitress at Brown's Pub. Though she appeared to be just a charming young woman, he knew her troubled past from Jimmy O'Reilly. At 24, Polly was adept at capturing attention, especially from Frank Patterson, whom she was tasked with charming as part of Stephen Fitzgerald's plan. Brandt, who had previously arrested Patterson and was recognized only in uniform, was assigned to support Polly and monitor Patterson's reactions. Despite Polly's skillful maneuvering, it took several drinks and a lot of persistence for Patterson to get her phone number. Polly, now living under a new name and working for Fitzgerald, was keen to leave her past behind. Fitzgerald's plan was to get close to Patterson, and Polly's role was crucial. Brandt, motivated by a desire to see Fitzgerald and O'Reilly face consequences, was wary of Sullivan, who he believed was too good for the role he was given. Sullivan, a man struggling with honesty, had been attacked and hospitalized after losing a district attorney race. Brandt thought Sullivan was a victim of a larger, corrupt scheme involving Patterson and others. Polly's manipulation had clearly captured Patterson's attention, masking her true intentions. Patterson, just about to leave, was intercepted by Pollyanna's charm. She leaned in with a friendly smile, offering him another drink. Brandt, standing by, reminded her to call if she heard anything. Polly's playful demeanor masked her true mission, keeping Patterson intrigued enough to give her his number. Brandt, focused on his assignment, knew he had to monitor Patterson while O'Reilly dealt with Greco. Tara O'Reilly and her team were tracking Greco, but had little to show for it. Jimmy O'Reilly, concerned about Greco and Patterson, was determined to find out who was behind the scheme and prevent further attacks. Jimmy's phone rang. Tara reported seeing Jose Martin Perez with Tony Greco. Jimmy guessed Perez was the banker needed to handle local police bribes. Tara watched Perez hand Greco an envelope before Greco abruptly left. Jimmy realized that Perez might be threatened and that he had to stir things up to reveal the real players behind the scenes. Jimmy's secretary, June, announced a call from Stephen Fitzgerald. Meeting in the Albany Law School library, Stephen brought a bag of documents. As Jimmy inspected the papers, Stephen revealed that about 50 people, including 10 key figures, were involved in the corruption. The governor was not directly implicated, but was in a precarious position. Stephen expressed frustration over the lack of progress and the need for legal changes to ensure justice. Jimmy questioned why Mary Ann McManus had to die if the file was meant to be kept secret. Stephen agreed it didn't seem accidental and suspected someone wanted the file revealed. As they discussed their next steps, Stephen and Jimmy agreed that identifying and stopping those behind the plot was crucial. "Focus on those not listed in the file," Stephen said. "The key players are those who know about it and how it got to McManus. They're involved in the plan, hiding behind a facade of safety." "Exactly," Jimmy agreed. "We need to draw them out. How?" "Send each a copy of the tape," Stephen suggested. "Patterson will crack first. He's the easier target. Greco thinks he's untouchable and won't ask for help until he's desperate. Patterson's already in trouble. Greco is more of a challenge." "All right, let's use the governor to pressure Greco," Jimmy said as Simone O'Reilly emerged from the hospital after a grueling 14-hour surgery. Exhausted, she headed to the food tent, reflecting on the grueling conditions and her troubled marriage. Her recent stint in the Congo had been the toughest yet, made worse by rumors of her husband's infidelity. The rebels had seized a mortar from the government and targeted the medical camp, believing the aid supported the government's cause. The mortar hit the supply tent, injuring the medical staff who were merely trying to help. Simone ducked for cover as explosions rocked the camp, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. Back home, Carrie Wilson learned of the attack before the official reports. She knew Simone O'Reilly was among the affected but had no details. Deciding to inform Jimmy in person, she found him unavailable and instead called Gerald Hawkins at the American Embassy in the Congo. "I'm Carrie Wilson, assistant to Governor Kincaid," she introduced herself. "We met at a fundraiser on K Street last year," Hawkins recognized her. "Yes, I remember. How can I assist?" "The governor is concerned about Dr. Simone O'Reilly, a surgeon at the attacked camp," Carrie said. "We don't have full details yet," Gerald Hawkins said, "but we're working on it. The governor understands the difficulties. I'll do my best to find out more about Dr. O'Reilly. How can I reach you?" Carrie asked. Hawkins provided his number. "Call or text me with any updates." Just then, Tony Greco stormed into Carrie's office, slamming a resignation letter on her desk. It announced the state police superintendent's resignation and the appointment of a temporary replacement. Tony was furious, feeling excluded from decisions about the state police, a protected group he was usually involved with. Carrie tried to calm him. "I don't know why the governor didn't include you." "Don't play games," Tony snapped. "This is O'Reilly's fault. He'll pay." As Tony left, Carrie wondered about Jimmy's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Linda Siegel settled into her new, rundown apartment in Croton, feeling lonely. She had never envisioned herself as the other woman, especially with Stephen Fitzgerald, whose wife was wealthy and glamorous. Linda wrestled with her feelings and career choices, contemplating breaking up with Stephen and quitting her job. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard Stephen's Honda Accord pull up. He knocked on her door and she let him in. He swept her up into a passionate embrace, leading her to the bedroom. They shared an intense, loving moment. Afterward, Linda asked, "Why are you here?" Stephen replied, "Didn't I just show you?" "No, I need to hear you say it," Linda insisted. "Words matter," Stephen said, holding her close. "I love you," Stephen said, gazing into her eyes. "What about your wife?" she asked, doubtful. "She knows about us and can't do anything. I left her a letter with my wedding ring saying I was leaving," Stephen explained. She embraced him, tears streaming down her face, unable to let him go. "I need to tell you something," she started. "It doesn't matter what you've done in the past," he interrupted. "What is it?" "It's about my job," she said, looking away. Stephen pulled her closer. "What's your boss's name?" "Nancy Ross Jordan," she replied. Stephen closed his eyes, trying to recall the name. "It might be right, but it feels distant. Let's just enjoy our time together tonight. We'll talk in the morning," he said, holding her tightly. "Do you forgive me?" she asked softly. "There's nothing to forgive. I should have shared more about my life. Sometimes it feels like those things happen to someone else," he said. She promised no more secrets, whispering, "I love you, even if you can't love me the same way." Stephen pondered if he truly loved her. He wasn't sure if he could love anyone, but he was starting to heal. He would tell her what she needed to do in the morning, knowing it was risky, but necessary. Meanwhile, Susan Singleton arrived at the Eastern State Center for Health to see Dr. Amanda Clark. The receptionist directed her to room 308. Inside, Dr. Clark, a serious woman in her 60s, examined Susan's case. "I understand you've been trying to get pregnant for 6 months," Dr. Clark began. "Usually we wait a year before worrying, but let's check." Susan mentioned her husband was away, which wasn't entirely true. Dr. Clark reviewed Susan's previous tests, revealing that her fallopian tubes were blocked due to an old gonorrhea infection. "That was years ago," Susan said, surprised. "I've been healthy for 15 years. Dr. Clark explained, "The damage persists. We can fix it with surgery and fertility treatments. You'll also need to make lifestyle changes, cut back on alcohol, work less, and get more rest." "When can I schedule the surgery?" Susan asked urgently. "I assume money isn't an issue," the doctor said, setting the surgery for the end of the week and advising Susan on vitamins and lifestyle changes. Leaving the clinic, Susan felt unsettled. A past mistake was now affecting her life. She walked to a Manhattan street corner, determined to change her life. As she called a cab, her phone buzzed with a message from Tony Greco, but she ignored it. As she got into the cab, her phone beeped again with his message. "What I do now is for you." Linda had finally prepared for her meeting with the U.S. Attorney, scheduled for Monday at 5 p.m. Stephen instructed her to stick to his brief, avoiding any extra details. "If she asks questions, just shrug and say you don't know," he said. At 5 o'clock sharp, Linda entered Nancy Ross Jordan's office. Nancy, seated comfortably with a bottle of scotch and 2 glasses on the coffee table, invited Linda to join her. "I was thinking of having a drink. Care to join me?" Nancy offered. "I'd love to," Linda replied, letting her worries fade. She had enjoyed a pleasant weekend with Stephen, visiting city sights and reminiscing about his past. Despite the enjoyment, she felt unease about Stephen's plans with O'Reilly. Nancy wasted no time. "So, do you have something for me?" she asked. "I have some information, but I'm not sure how useful it will be," Linda said hesitantly. "Just tell me," Nancy urged. Linda relayed that Stephen was negotiating an agreement with a lawyer for the governor, mentioning a file and a timing issue. She didn't know the lawyer's name, only that he worked unofficially for the governor and that the agreement was made at Albany Law School. Nancy pressed for more details. "Anything else?" He discussed a time limit for reopening the case, but no specific date. The governor is under pressure to act soon. The file's location is unknown, but Stephen has it. Nancy's questioning lasted 30 minutes, with Linda sticking to her scripted responses. When asked when Stephen would be seen again, Linda replied he wouldn't meet Nancy for a few days, as he was planning to see his wife and possibly ask for a divorce. Nancy thanked Linda, who was relieved to leave. She hoped Stephen's strategy would work, even if Nancy didn't fully believe the story. Meanwhile, Stephen Fitzgerald was at Catherine DeVoe Singleton's house, marveling at how attractive and lively his mother-in-law was for her age. Catherine's casual flirting was typical, but her husband, Joe Singleton, was indifferent to his sons-in-law, viewing them as mere potential fathers for his future grandkids. "What do you need, Stephen?" Catherine asked after small talk. "A favor," Stephen replied. "I need you to keep a briefcase in your bank safe. No questions, no opening it. Just keep it secure and don't tell anyone." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "That sounds mysterious. How long do you need me to keep it?" "Keep the briefcase until I return or until you hear I'm gone," Stephen instructed. Catherine DeVoe was unsettled by his mention of his own death, but tried to mask her concern. "What's in it for me?" she asked. "I won't end my marriage with your daughter. She can choose to leave me, playing the victim if she wishes," Stephen replied. Catherine pondered this. Despite her misgivings about her daughter's marital prospects, she understood Stephen's point. "What if you don't come back?" Catherine asked. "Give it to Sidney Levy, the Attorney General. Tell him it's from Stephen Fitzgerald and that Jimmy O'Reilly has the keys. He'll know what to do," Stephen said, explaining that Levy, known for his strong morals and family devotion, was the right person to handle the case. "Why me?" Catherine asked. "You've raised 3 wonderful kids despite their choices, and you've always been a good person," Stephen said. Catherine's comment about her bank vault led to an uneasy laugh from both. As Catherine processed this, Carrie walked into her office on Tuesday morning. Gerald Hawkins called with an update. Victims were moved to Kinshasa, severe cases flown to France, and American cases would be treated in Germany. Mrs. O'Reilly was among the serious cases and was praised for her bravery. "The names of the injured and deceased will be released around 7 p.m. our time," Gerald said. "We're trying to reach Mr. O'Reilly but haven't succeeded. Please pass on my number if you contact him." Carrie, feeling the weight of her situation, wondered about Jimmy's whereabouts. At the public housing building, Sophia Thompson, 48, lived alone after her children had grown up. Leroy Thompson, her oldest son, still owed Jimmy money from past legal help. Jimmy, staying with Sophia, used a burner phone to stay in touch with his sister and Stephen Fitzgerald while reviewing a notebook he'd taken from Cecilia Porter. He needed more information about the ledger. As he gazed out the window, he felt restless. He missed his kids, who were safe with his sister, and was eager to be part of the unfolding events. His trust in Tara was strong, but he was unsure about others. In Manhattan, Stephen Fitzgerald met with the Niazov group at the Midtown Marriott. Their dissatisfaction with the church's response was palpable. While some sought a legal battle, most wanted a fair resolution. Stephen acknowledged their pain but stressed that a fair outcome was the most realistic goal. Stephen told his friends, "We might not get what we truly deserve, but revenge is God's domain. If we seek more than just money, happiness will elude us. Trust me, either we'll get what's coming to us, or this will become the biggest scandal this state has ever seen." He left them reassured and went to take a shower, anticipating a significant event that night. A knock at the door interrupted him. Clad in a hotel robe, he opened the door to Susan. "You're early," he said. Susan stepped inside, clearly upset. "I thought you could just forget about me. I'm your wife." "I left a note explaining everything," Stephen replied. Susan's gaze was firm. "You didn't say you no longer loved me or that you love someone else. You didn't explain why you're leaving now or mention divorce. You should have been honest about everything." Stephen smiled. "I'm planning to be a loyal husband from now on." Susan's anger flared, but she controlled it. "I don't want an annulment, and money can't fix everything. I'm leaving you not for money, but for my dignity." "Confident, aren't you?" Stephen said. "Realistic," Susan retorted. "You've hidden your pain from me. Even after all the mistakes, a partner should share their troubles. But I haven't had a true husband." Stephen grinned. "It's all my fault then." "No, but I deserve a fair chance." "If I fail, I won't argue about divorce. But let me try," Susan pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I want to be your wife. Please, let me help." "I'm trying to do what's best," Stephen said, embracing her. "Then let's share a special moment one last time," Susan begged. Reluctantly, Stephen agreed. As they made love, he realized that no other woman would ever make him feel the same way. Afterwards, Susan dressed and prepared to leave. "I'm sorry for my mistakes," she said. "Remember, I'll never regret what we just shared." With that, she left, and Stephen was left alone, feeling the weight of a love that seemed lost. The final call came late, almost midnight. Ed Brandt had tracked Polly and Patterson to a small colonial-style house in Loudonville. Tonight, Polly had convinced Patterson to go out for drinks, leaving Ed to wait in his Chevy Lumina. He planned to meet Polly at a diner later. Suddenly, Jimmy O'Reilly appeared at Ed's window. "I thought you might need help," Jimmy said. "Greco is speeding toward New York City. My sister and her team are after him." Ed glanced at Patterson's house. "Patterson's fine. He's with Polly and should be done by midnight. Polly will catch a taxi and meet me." Just then, Polly burst from the house, visibly distressed. "Let me go!" she cried as Ed tried to restrain her. "What's wrong?" Ed asked, confused. "He's dead!" Polly shouted. "If you didn't do it, then who did?" Jimmy and Ed managed to calm her down and returned to the house. Inside, they found Patterson dead, a needle in his arm and a can of brown powder on the table. Ed sniffed the powder. "This isn't just heroin. I can't identify it." Jimmy asked, "Who's the most suspicious?" "First Sullivan, then Fitzgerald," Ed replied. "Or maybe all three of us." O'Reilly turned to Polly. "Tell us everything." "He was jumpy all week but seemed normal tonight," Polly explained. "He made a call before we left." Jimmy searched Patterson's jacket and found a second phone in his pants. It had a number starting with a New York State campus code. "Let's leave before anyone notices," Jimmy said. After midnight, Linda called Fitzgerald urgently. Despite his guilt about leaving Susan, Stephen drove out to Yonkers. The streets of Croton were empty when he arrived at Linda's apartment. He rang the bell and knocked, but the door swung open easily. Inside, he saw Tony Greco's body on the floor, blood staining the carpet. A voice from the shadows said, "Please come in, Mr. Fitzgerald. Close the door behind you." Linda sat in a wingback chair looking lifeless. A man with a gun emerged from the shadows. "Don't worry," the man said calmly. "She will wake up." The man with the gun watched as Linda slept, her heartbeat steady though slow. He wished he knew more about medicine beyond the basics he picked up from Pat Sullivan, who had hoped to be a doctor. Sullivan's interest in women, however, amused him. "Do you find this amusing?" the gunman asked. "Not really," Fitzgerald replied. "But I'm curious why you haven't shot me yet. The file, where is it?" "Somewhere safe," Fitzgerald said. Not a helpful answer. "Didn't you keep a copy?" "Of course," Fitzgerald said. "Call me Steve." "Should I call you father?" the gunman mocked. "Monsignor Morlock, soon to be an archbishop, I hear." "So you made a copy when you gave the file to Bishop McManus?" Fitzgerald asked. "Backup documents are wise, but I need the original. Finding it would create a scandal," Morlock explained. "Since you plan to eliminate me, why should I help?" Fitzgerald asked. "I'm sure we can reach an agreement." "But what about Nancy Ross? She wouldn't want a loose end," Morlock said. Fitzgerald reminded him, "I was the witness. Ross spoke to me a lot. Pat's lawyer kept him quiet." Morlock grumbled about Ross interfering. "We never intended to lose the file. The bishop's safe was perfect. The file was meant to resurface and cause a scandal before the election. But McManus took it and wouldn't return it," Fitzgerald said. Morlock expressed frustration about Ross's meddling. "Now we have you, Steve. Where's the file?" "I gave it to someone trustworthy with a secure bank safe," Fitzgerald said. "That's unfortunate. It wouldn't be good if Miss Siegel had to be dealt with," Morlock warned. "Expecting Tara O'Reilly?" Fitzgerald asked, noting the police's involvement. "Everything's handled." Patterson agreed to help with Sullivan's death. His plan failed, so he made it look like an overdose linked to O'Reilly, Morlock said. "You thought of everything. How about we call your friend and discuss the file?" Fitzgerald suggested. "Actually, you missed one person," Fitzgerald said. "Oh yes, the jealous wife," Morlock said, turning as Teresa Hartman emerged from the bedroom. Hartman aimed her Smith & Wesson at Morlock. "I've never used this outside of practice," she said. Before Morlock could react, Hartman fired. He collapsed, his gun discharging into the door frame. Hartman quickly secured the gun and checked Morlock's pulse. Finding none, she let out a sigh. "You should tell your girlfriend to fix the broken lock on the patio door," Hartman said. Stephen, holding Linda, dialed 911 for an ambulance and police. Hartman asked, "How did you know it was the priest?" Fitzgerald smiled. "A name was missing from the file. You saw the cover-up happen. The missing assistant DA wasn't in the story because the Monsignor took it from McMahon's safe and left it with the bishop." McManus's wife messed up the plan, Fitzgerald concluded. Teresa and Jimmy listened as the first sirens approached, a rare, cheerful sound in the early morning hours. The Circle Diner was nearly empty at 4 a.m. When Carrie burst in and hugged Jimmy, the few patrons and staff looked up. "Jimmy, I've been worried," Carrie exclaimed. "I'm fine. I have important news," Jimmy said. "Call the governor. Tony Greco is dead and reporters will soon arrive." Carrie, shocked but compliant, took a seat in the back. Jimmy directed the waitress to distract Ed and Paulie while he spoke to the governor. The governor, alert and not at all tired, asked for details. "We have 3 victims. Frank Patterson, for one. He appears to have overdosed," Jimmy said. "I know him. He called a number before he died that might belong to the state police," the governor responded. "Give me that number." Jimmy relayed the news to Carrie, who then looked grave as she approached him. "Your wife was caught in a rebel attack in the Congo. She's alive but badly injured and has been moved to France or Germany," Carrie said. Jimmy, focused on his job, had been distant from his wife's plight. "Do you know how bad her injuries are?" "No specifics, but the State Department is ready to help. Here's a number for you," Carrie offered. "Thanks. I need to call my daughters," Jimmy said, rising to leave. Ed, also standing, advised, "You need someone to help you until this is over." Carrie agreed and left with Jimmy. Polly, left alone, declined more coffee, saying she needed sleep. Stephen Fitzgerald, exhausted, wished he could rest. The FBI had taken over from the local police. Agent Costello, a tall, thin man in his late 50s, introduced himself and began overseeing the forensic team's work. Teresa Hartman, with her notebook, handed her gun to the local police and watched as paramedics took Linda away. Costello approached Teresa. "We'll return your notebook after our questioning. You're free to go for now." He then turned to Fitzgerald. "Mr. Fitzgerald, you need to come with us." "What if I refuse?" Fitzgerald asked. "Then I'll have to arrest you. I have a special warrant. If you cooperate, I won't need it." "We both know you're in danger," Costello replied. Fitzgerald, with little choice, agreed to go. "Where are we headed?" "To our office in Newark. We'll transport Sullivan and O'Reilly there for safekeeping once we find them." Linda awoke in a hospital bed, struggling to breathe with a strange sensation in her throat. Surrounded by beeping machines and in what seemed like a special unit, she saw a male nurse quickly summon a doctor. A short Hispanic woman in green scrubs entered. "Thank you for waking up," the doctor said. The doctor reassured Linda as she removed the breathing tube. "We managed to clear the poison. The paramedics put you on a ventilator and gave you naloxone. You're in a safe place now." Linda attempted to speak, but the doctor gently stopped her. "Don't try to talk. I'll take the tube out soon." After swiftly removing the tube, Linda asked about Stephen. "If he's the friend who called for help, I believe he's okay, but he's not here," the doctor replied. "You're in the emergency area right now, and we need to move you to your room once you're stable." Linda was moved to a secure floor at Westchester Medical Center, where guards monitored locked gates. Her room had 2 female guards stationed outside, and one of them, Brenda Sussman, was familiar to Linda from the DA's office. "Hi, Linda. How are you?" Brenda asked, her concern evident. She pulled up a chair and sat beside Linda, her dark skin contrasting with Linda's pale complexion. "We're all watching out for you, don't worry." Linda, feeling uneasy, inquired about Stephen Fitzgerald. Brenda mentioned rumors that the FBI had taken him but had released the woman who shot the priest. The DA was distressed, but Brenda didn't have many details. Dr. Reyes later entered, informing Linda that urgent visitors were downstairs. "There's a deputy attorney from Washington and an FBI agent named Costello with news about Stephen." Linda, her throat feeling better, chose to speak with the FBI agent. After a brief wait, a tall, thin woman in a dark business suit entered. She introduced herself as Nancy Reeves, a deputy attorney general. "We need to be discreet," Nancy whispered, glancing at the guards. "I'm here from Washington to talk about the man who attacked you." Linda, her voice hoarse, replied, "2 men broke into my apartment and made me call Stephen. I don't know much else." Linda tried to recall what happened, but could only remember the basics. Nancy Reeves asked, "You have an idea who might be behind this, don't you?" "I'm not sure, but Stephen might know," Linda replied weakly. Nancy, smirking, said, "Mr. Fitzgerald isn't talking, but he's safe. Unfortunately, Miss Ross got sick and will have to step down. If you work with me in Washington, I can introduce you to a better team." Linda asked, Why are you in the organized crime section? Nancy warned, you might not want to know all the answers. Just stay quiet for now. Meanwhile, James O'Reilly, recently released from federal custody, navigated the labyrinthine Albany Medical Center. After 3 days of confinement without questions or contact, the FBI informed him that his wife, Simon Mercer O'Reilly, was in serious condition and had been flown in by military plane. They also announced she would receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Lost in the sprawling hospital, Jimmy finally reached Dr. Timothy Croke's office after confusing directions. Dr. Croke, visibly exhausted, explained the situation. Your wife had an injury to her legs. We believe we can save them, but she will likely lose her right foot. She knows and has agreed to the surgery, Dr. Croke said. Jimmy, feeling out of touch after days of isolation, asked, Do I need to approve the surgery too? Yes, since her medical forms are under your name. Also, there's a small risk to the baby from the anesthesia. It's minimal, but it's something to be aware of, Dr. Croke explained matter-of-factly. Jimmy, unflinching, responded, I trust her judgment. When can our daughters visit? She'll be ready for a visit tomorrow morning, Dr. Croke confirmed. Jimmy decided not to see his wife just yet. I'll have my sister bring the girls. I don't need to see her now. Dr. Croke praised Simon. She's a real hero. Despite her injuries, she helped others. She's an extraordinary doctor and a strong woman. Yes, she's a remarkable doctor, but maybe not the best wife or mother, Jimmy said as he left Dr. Croke's office. He found himself alone and uneasy in the governor's conference room in New York City. The governor, with his assistant Carrie Wilson, greeted Jose Perez, formerly John Martin, with an unnervingly cheerful demeanor. Jose, nervously shifting his gaze from the governor to Carrie, braced for the explanation of his role in the failed plan that resulted in 3 deaths. You're probably wondering why you're here, the governor began, his smile failing to mask his seriousness. I have complete files on the Catholic Diocese of New York, including the parts you tried to conceal. I also have tapes that could be risky but might be useful. What do you want from me? Jose asked. Carrie handed him a document. Sign this. It acknowledges you were misled about the conspiracy's true goals, showing you were coerced into participating. I'll keep it confidential. And what's in it for me? Jose asked. You'll take the role of speaker but follow my orders. Or you face life in Attica, the governor replied. The federal agents won't act, but I have enough to prove your guilt. How do I know you won't leak this to the media? Jose asked. The governor grinned. I'm just as shady as you are. The first thing we need is a bill to extend the time for reporting child abuse. It's a small price to keep Mr. Fitzgerald quiet. I have plans to secure support for it. Jose was skeptical. The Senate won't back it. That's not my problem. My legal team will handle it, the governor said. Sign the paper. Reluctantly, Jose signed the document, which Carrie then filed away. As Jose left, the governor turned to his assistant. That went better than expected. You didn't give him much choice, she replied. The governor continued. You're moving to the Court of Claims. After that, we'll look into promoting you to judge. It's crucial to distance yourself from people like O'Reilly. But Jamie is a good man, the assistant protested. Being right doesn't always work in politics. Image matters more, the governor said. Does O'Reilly have the archdiocese's support? I believe so, the assistant replied. Good. Prepare a meeting with DeVoe. I want to discuss legalizing marijuana and universal health care. Voters have short memories, and we need to reposition the Democratic Party. What about Fitzgerald? The assistant asked. The governor smiled. I've taken care of that. Don't worry. A man like him would never admit to being a victim. He'd see it as a weakness, the governor said, confident he had covered all bases. In his ornate office, the cardinal sat behind a desk adorned with angels, waiting for a meeting he hoped would bring clarity. Mr. O'Reilly, a lawyer with a dubious reputation, had chosen to work with the church despite its issues. He hoped to uncover something useful about a missing file related to the church. The cardinal, grieving Monsignor Morlock and dealing with betrayal, had held multiple services for the deceased. His advisors had hinted that Morlock was scheming behind his back, revealing the dark side of ambition. Father Phillips announced James O'Reilly, who entered the room with a serious demeanor. Please have a seat and tell me why you're here, the cardinal said. Thank you. I need your help to change the rules so that crimes against children can still be reported, even after many years, O'Reilly explained. The cardinal, who believed in healing through forgiveness rather than legal action, frowned. We believe seeking justice after so many years doesn't help victims or the community. O'Reilly handed over a packet of papers. These documents show 2 bank accounts, one in Ireland. Monsignor Robert Montgomery used a fake church to funnel money. Elizabeth Cullen and her daughter Lisa have been withdrawing from these accounts. The cardinal's frown deepened. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm presenting facts, O'Reilly replied, pulling out a signed statement from Beth Cullen and a DNA sample from her daughter. I also have your DNA, courtesy of a sample from your housekeeper's hairbrush. Are you threatening me? The cardinal said, rising angrily. O'Reilly remained calm. I'll leave my card. Call me if you want to discuss this further. The ledger shows not just the money, but where it came from. The church might forgive sins, but it doesn't tolerate theft. The cardinal sat heavily as O'Reilly departed. Meanwhile, Stephen Fitzgerald, at his old home, was contemplating his next move. A month after the incident at Linda's, he was preparing to move out. Linda was heading to Washington, and Stephen sensed she didn't want him to come along. His reputation had suffered, and although the FBI knew the truth about the deaths of Greco and Patterson, they weren't sharing it. Susan's unexpected arrival surprised him. "Welcome home," she said, mentioning her new Tesla and her reason for coming. She needed to pick up clothes for work. Stephen's response was mixed with disbelief. "Congratulations, but how is this my problem?" "Because you're the father," Susan replied. Stephen, with a mocking laugh, said, "I'll need to take your word for it. Laugh all you want, but DNA tests will settle this. Are you really keeping the baby? Isn't that going to be tough for you?" "Our baby is not just a thing," Susan replied. "I want to be a good mother and deal with everything else later." "Good intentions won't change the reality," Stephen retorted. "Raising a child alone is hard, and I won't help you. You should end the pregnancy." Susan, hurt by his callous words, felt a pang of betrayal. Their marriage, once seen as a fairy tale, had soured, partly due to Tony and Stephen's own issues. Though she had chosen her husband over her lover, he had pushed her away. "Is this about embarrassment?" Susan asked, seeking a reason for his anger. Stephen, bitter, said, "That man tried to hurt me. Your secrets are everywhere. The media's got some things wrong, but one thing is clear. I'm married to someone who's let me down." Susan turned away, tears streaming as she realized the loving husband she once relied on was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, signaling the end of their marriage, at least for her. Meanwhile, Carrie Wilson was facing her own challenges. Despite practicing her lines, breaking up with Jimmy for a high-profile job felt like a bad script. Everyone knew her fake engagement with Raymond had ended, and rumors about her and O'Reilly had made her uncomfortable. Her relationship with Jimmy O'Reilly, tainted by scandal, had also affected her. The media painted her as the other woman, while Jimmy, despite being a suspect in multiple high-profile deaths, was trying to salvage his reputation. Carrie's career was at stake, and she had to choose between her job and her love for Jimmy. The governor's advice echoed, "Women in politics are judged by their partners, and Jimmy was a liability." With the church's reluctant agreement to the new child protection law and Jose Perez publicly praising the governor, Carrie felt torn. She couldn't have both the career and the man she loved. In a bid to resolve her internal conflict, she arranged to meet Jimmy at Jack's restaurant, a once popular bar now overshadowed by newer spots. The bar was mostly empty but loud, filled with older patrons. As Carrie and Jimmy sat in a quiet corner, the local news buzzed about another shooting, and the weight of their decisions loomed large. At the bar, the presence of James O'Reilly and Stephen Fitzgerald drew curiosity, but no one dared approach them. Known for their authority and history of trouble, their conversation was a spectacle. On the TV, the news shifted to state politics, announcing a new law extending the time for childhood crime victims to come forward. The anchor praised Carrie Wilson for her role in passing the bill, hinting she might soon get a new job. The news then moved to the governor's visit to Iowa. Fitzgerald turned to O'Reilly. "Congratulations on getting the church's support. Credit goes to everyone who worked on it," O'Reilly replied. Both men reflected on Mary McManus, a notable figure in their recent troubles. The barmaid arrived with fresh drinks, and Fitzgerald asked if O'Reilly planned to sue for a share of the church's assets. O'Reilly declined, saying he had made peace with the past and valued the chance for justice more than material gain. They toasted to their achievements, acknowledging that justice is hard to achieve, but they had made a difference. Fitzgerald mentioned his partner's departure, and O'Reilly joked about the fleeting nature of love. They both sighed about their luck and challenges. Epilogue. Catherine DeVoe Singleton, proudly rocking her twin grandsons in a Silver Cross baby carriage by her Connecticut lake, reflected on her family's legacy. The boys, looking different from each other, were the latest in a long line of DeVoes, a prominent family dating back before American independence. Catherine, observing the Democratic National Convention, hoped for her daughter's success and her own influence over Governor Kincaid. With a file from her son-in-law, she felt empowered in ways not seen since the Civil War. Although Stephen struggled with his new role, Catherine, a formidable figure, managed to reach a sharing agreement for the children's care. The uneasy peace between her and Stephen highlighted the ongoing tensions, with O'Reilly's words about ex-wives and mothers-in-law echoing in the background. 4-year-old Anna Randall was struggling with her green beans, hoping her grandmother, Silva Keenan, would be too engrossed in the loud news to notice. The TV was broadcasting a story about Uncle Robert, whom Anna had never met, as he was in heaven with Grandpa Mike and others in a family photo above the fireplace. Anna's mother wasn't around either, and while Grandma said she might return someday, for now, it was just the two of them. Visitors often came, some crying, and Anna tried to comfort them. They spoke of someone named Thistle Gary, but Grandma avoided discussing him and no longer woke up crying in the night. "Finish your green beans," Grandma urged. "There are too many," Anna protested. "There aren't even 10, Grandma replied. She reminded Anna that she promised to eat the beans if she got fish sticks later. Silva had her own struggles. Her daughter, Pollyanna, returned home after being in prison and pregnant. Polly's difficult past was linked to her mother's troubled life and abusive marriage to Thomas Randall. Silva found solace and love with her neighbor, Red Mike Keenan, a much older widower who ended up marrying her. Silver was determined to keep Pollyanna's child, Anna, in the Keenan family despite the challenges. Raising Anna alone in Queens was tough, and only child abuse support groups visited after losing her son Robert and Mike. As Silva dealt with her worries, Anna dashed to the door at a knock. Standing there was a tall man, Ed Brandt, who introduced himself. Silva, suspecting he was a police officer, was surprised when he revealed he was retired. "I'm here to talk about Pollyanna," Ed said. "She's waiting for you in my car. I've asked her to marry me and wanted to ask for your blessing." Silva, who had experienced a happy marriage despite age differences, agreed, but with one condition. "You must bring Pollyanna home to her daughter and mother." Ed nodded, accepting Silva's rule, and the family's future looked hopeful. "Stay here, Anna. I'm going to get your mom. Thanks for listening to One Infidelity Hit. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop us a like.